Augiri Emmanuel was born in 1911 and passed away in 2001. The Indian economist Jairus Banerjee called him the last great left-wing theoretician of the 20th century. This book aims to explore his work, but also to place it in a 21st century context, as his ideas continue to cast light on the development of capitalism in its decline. I read Unequal Exchange after its publication in English by Monthly Review Press in 1972. The political implications of unequal exchange on the international solidarity of the working class presented in the book were similar to the ones promoted by the organization, Communist Working Circle, I belonged to at the time. In that milieu, there were not many with such a perspective, and as such, we reached out to Emmanuel in 1974 and maintained contact by letters and occasional visits until he passed away. After many years of insufficient interest in the political economy of imperialism, there has in recent years been a growing interest in the work of Emmanuel, reflected in many articles and books and the republishing of his main work, Unequal Exchange, a study of the imperialism of trade. The reason for the decline of interest in the theory of unequal exchange in the last decades of the 20th century and the first of the 21st century was not that it has become irrelevant. On the contrary, the flow of value by unequal exchange accelerated as industrial production on a huge scale was outsourced to low-wage countries. Instead, the reason for the lack of interest was neoliberal ideological dominance, also penetrating deep into left-wing movement and their intellectual production. With the ongoing decline of neoliberalism and US hegemony, the discourse of anti-imperialism has made a comeback, and so has the interest in the political economy of imperialism. That is welcome. The growing interest in unequal exchange theory has also led to the formation of the Emmanuel Association. Its website has a rich digital archive of documents from Emmanuel's personal archive. The association has also been the driving force behind the establishment of an archive of his left papers at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. On January 29-30, 2026, the association is hosting a conference on the work of Emmanuel. In 1974, we first made contact with Emmanuel, and so, after 50 years of living with Emmanuel's political thinking, it is fitting to close the circle and sum up his work. Outline of the book. In Chapter 1, I present Emmanuel's biography, as it is important for the development of his ideas. Before embarking on an academic career at the age of 50, Emmanuel had practical expertise not only in economics, from working in Greece and then the Congo Free State, but also in political activism, sometimes under dramatic circumstances. In Chapter 2, I present the theory of unequal exchange. Since it is based on Marx's conception of value and the accumulation process of capital, I explain unequal exchange by following its development from the simple cell in capitalism, the commodity, through the production and circulation processes and international trade, thereby mirroring Marx's structure in capital. From there, I proceed by bringing the theory into the 21st century. I do this by drawing on new material from Emmanuel's personal archive, dependency theorists such as Samir Amin, Rui Mauro Marini, Andre Gunder Frank, Emmanuel Wallerstein, and contemporaneous theorists such as Donald Cleland, John Smith, and Andrea Ricci. In Chapter 3, I deal with the size of unequal exchange. First, the question of how to measure it. The discussion of the different calculation methods reveals the factors which have an impact on the size of unequal exchange. Then I will discuss the most important empirical studies of unequal exchange. What is the actual size of unequal exchange? How has it developed in the past 2 centuries? To what extent can it explain the polarization of the world system in terms of living conditions? In Chapter 4, I look at the political consequences of unequal exchange for the international solidarity of the working class. Emmanuel's work was much more than the theory of unequal exchange. In 1974, he published Profit and Crises, which deals with the fundamental contradictions in the capitalist mode of production. As capitalism is entering a deep structural crisis, this work is becoming more relevant than ever. In the beginning of the 1980s, Emmanuel was preoccupied with the connection between the transfer of technology by multinational companies and the development of the productive forces in the global south, predicting the rise of China. He also was preoccupied by the significance of dollars as world money, the role of the state, and more specific political issues, such as settler colonialism. All these questions were, of course, not isolated, but interlinked as a coherent conception of how capitalism works. In Chapter 5, I deal with Emmanuel's theory of the fundamental contradiction in the capitalist mode of production, between the need to expand production and the attendant level of consumption power generated by production, which is insufficient to realize profit through the sale of goods. In Chapter 6, I explain how the mechanism of unequal exchange became the historical solution to the contradiction in capitalism, creating a polarized dynamic of overdevelopment in the center and underdevelopment in the periphery. The chapter also tells the story of how neoliberal globalization of production changed that pattern, and how, subsequently, China managed to break the polarizing dynamic in capitalism. signaling profound changes in the economic and political balance in the world system. In Chapter 7, I deal with the ecological aspects of unequal exchange, which Emmanuel mentions in passing. With the growing significance of ecological and climate problems, the school of ecological unequal exchange has developed from the 1980s and onwards. In the final Chapter 9, I open up for a discussion on the future development of capitalism and a possible transfer towards socialism within this century. How is it possible to end the curse of unequal exchange on humanity? How is it possible to develop a mode of production which generates a more equal world and one in balance with nature? Since I am not a utopian idealist, I try to do this on the basis of the existing conditions in the world system. Taking into account the existing world economy and the existing political forces, what can the first practical steps be? The historical context of the theory of unequal exchange. To paraphrase Mao Zedong, where do correct ideas come from? Do they drop from the sky? No, they come from social practice, the struggle for production, the class struggle, and scientific work. There is a close link between what goes on in the world, historical development, the projects of classes and states, and theoretical and political debates. What characterized the historical development of the long 1960s, 1955-75, that brought forth the theory of unequal exchange? One major event was the decolonization process in the wake of the Second World War. The two world wars cleared the way for the soon-to-be new hegemon after the decline of the British Empire, the United States. The decline of the European colonial empires and the rise of the Soviet Union as a balancing force against the rise of the United States created a window of opportunity for national liberation movements in the colonies in what became known as the Third World. The post-war US pushed for decolonization to open the former European colonies for US investment and trade, the transformation from colonialism to neocolonialism. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union saw the creation of new states opposed to colonialism as possible, new allies against Western capitalism. The Asian and African countries from the first wave of decolonization participated in the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. They stressed the importance of independence from both East and West and the development of their national economies. The Bandung Conference was not a new communist international that strived for the socialist world revolution as the Comintern had done since its formation in 1919. It was the expression of the national liberation struggles against colonialism, which in some instances meant communist forces taking the lead. The new global hegemon had to make sure that the decolonization process ended in free enterprise for US capital and not with socialist-orientated states linked to the socialist bloc. Therefore, from around 1965 to 1975, the main contradiction in the world was between the US and the different anti-imperialist liberation movements and socialist-orientated states. The Vietnam War became the symbol of this contradiction. The rise of socialist-orientated projects in the Third World, from China and Vietnam in the East to Cuba and Chile in the West, produced new theoretical and political debates, most prominently around the Chinese interpretation of Marxism in the form of Maoism, but also from other Third World revolutionaries. These included Che Guevara and Fidel Castro in Cuba, Frantz Fanon in Algiers, Ho Chi Minh and Nguyen Giap in Vietnam, Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, and Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. The revolutionary spirit of China, Vietnam, Cuba, and other countries had a strong impact on anti-imperialist theory. Before the 1960s, the Marxist understanding of imperialism was almost exclusively based on V.I. Lenin's writing from around the time of the First World War, especially imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism from 1917. In the late 50s, things began to change. New perspectives emerged, both from Third World revolutionaries and from academics. The latter were mostly connected to the so-called New Left and criticized both the capitalist world system and existing socialist projects. The US representative of this strain of thought was Paul Baran, a professor at Stanford University and a leading figure in the journal Monthly Review, founded in 1949. Baran defined monopoly capitalism as a transnational rather than a national phenomenon. This reflected the development of capitalism in the US after the Second World War. A special feature of transnational monopoly capitalism was the underdevelopment of the Third World. In 1957, Baran's book, The Political Economy of Growth, was published. In 1966, Monopoly Capital was released, written by Baran together with Monthly Review editor Paul Sweezy. Baran did not write about unequal exchange or third world dependency. His main interests were monopoly capital, investment, and profit, but his underlining of underdevelopment as a consequence of global capitalism posed a serious challenge to mainstream economists, who insisted that third world countries would develop if only they followed the example of the Western world. Baran's work was of importance to those theorists of imperialism who rose to prominence in the 1960s: Andre Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein, and Augurio Manuel. After a meeting with Baran in 1964, Gunder Frank wrote that Baran's systematic investigation of capitalist development and underdevelopment, defining them as two sides of the same coin, had opened the door to a new understanding of world history, the present, and the future. Che Guevara was also an admirer of Baran. In 1960, he welcomed him to Cuba to discuss underdevelopment and related economic questions, the renewal of imperialism theory in the US, centered around the journal Monthly Review, including theorists such as Sweezy and Harry Magdoff. Later, Immanuel Wallerstein, who had studied liberation movements in Africa, developed his world system theory. In Latin America, several academics such as Celso Furtado, Anibal Pinto, and later Rui Mauro Marini began to formulate the theory of dependency. Dependency theory described imperialism as a system with a center, the metropole consisting of North America, Western Europe, and Japan, and an exploited periphery, the Third World. Third world countries supplied the metropole with raw materials and tropical agricultural commodities produced by cheap labor, while the metropole had political and economic control. The development of the periphery was deemed impossible within the capitalist world system. Development in third world countries would only become possible if there was a revolution that cut off the pipeline of value transfer to the metropole. Gunder Frank, who was living in Chile, wrote an essay in 1963 on the connection between development and underdevelopment. From Africa, the Egyptian Samia Amin presented his thesis, The Origins of Underdevelopment, Capitalist Accumulation on a World Scale in 1970. Besides dealing with the issue of unequal exchange in international trade, Amin put forward the thesis of a law of globalized value resulting in an imperialist rent in favor of central powers. According to Amin, the wage differences between North and South workers generate an unequal exchange. However, Arguiri Emmanuel was the first to rigorously and systematically emphasize the crucial role of wage differences as a fundamental cause of unequal exchange in trade between nations. Having been in the Congo from 1937 to 1941 and again from 1946 to 1960, Emmanuel presented his theory of unequal exchange in Paris in 1963. All of these theorists used unequal exchange in the world market as part of their understanding of how imperialism transfers value, showing how ideas are historically determinate rather than a product of the mind of an individual genius. Here, let's focus on Emmanuel and his specific context. Emmanuel, a man of the 20th century. Emmanuel was born 1911 in Patras, Greece. At the time, Greece was in the semi-periphery, if not the periphery, of the capitalist world system. His mother worked as a teacher, which was remarkable at that time in conservative Greek Catholic society. His father had a business selling textiles. Emmanuel's childhood was at the time of the first wave of revolutionary uprisings in the periphery, the Taiping Rebellion in 1911 and the Russian Revolution in 1917. It was also the era of inter-imperialist rivalry. Greece took part in the Balkan Wars 1912–13 and was also drawn into the First World War and subsequently into yet another war, the Greco-Turkish War from 1919 to 1922. The world economic crisis of 1929 hit Greece severely, leading to continued mass emigration. Emmanuel studied at the High School of Economics and Commerce in Athens from 1927 to 1932, and then at the Faculty of Law until 1934, from where he went on to work in a trading firm in Athens. At the time, the political situation was unstable in Greece, as in the rest of Europe, with fascism on the rise. In 1936, Prime Minister Metaxas initiated a self-coup and established a fascist anti-communist regime. In the midst of these events, Emmanuel's father died in 1937, and as the eldest son, he became responsible for the well-being of his mother and sisters. To raise money, Emmanuel decided to emigrate. Most Greek emigrants went to the United States. However, this flow was restricted in the 1930s by US anti-immigration laws, and Emmanuel was not very fond of the US, so he decided to go to Belgian King Leopold II's colony in the Congo, then known as the Congo Free State, where some friends of the family had settled and established a small textile import business in Stanleyville. Immigrants from southern Europe, such as Greeks, were generally perceived as not entirely white by the Belgian settlers in the Congo. Emmanuel's experiences in the Congo provided him with illustrative practical examples of settler colonialism which he used in his later writings. The extreme difference in wages between Africans and European settlers and the brutal racist Belgian regime were a microcosm of the center-periphery division in the world system. The mutiny. Back in Greece, despite the leader Metaxas's fascist ideology, he did not side with the Axis powers due to his conservative royalist nationalist feelings, so the Germans occupied the country in May 1941. The Greek King George II, accompanied by the Metaxas administration, fled to Egypt where they established a government in exile. In Greece, the starvation winter of 1941-42 and the brutal occupation killed 500,000, driving many to join the resistance movement National Liberation Front, EAM, whose driving force was the Communist Party of Greece. They fought a successful guerrilla struggle against the Nazi occupation on the Greek mainland and on the island of Crete. In 1942, inspired by the EAM resistance, Emmanuel left the Congo to volunteer for the Greek Liberation Forces in the Middle East. He became a naval officer on a ship based in Alexandria in Egypt, hoping to engage in the struggle against Nazi Germany. However, the Greek forces in the Middle East were controlled by the Metaxas government. In coordination with the British forces, they wanted to spare the army to be ready to fight against EAM to regain control over Greece when the war against Germany ended. The majority of the 30,000 Greek soldiers in the Middle East supported EAM. In order to control them, thousands were interned in British prison camps in the region. The Greek communists were seen as a greater danger than the Nazis by the Greek ruling class and their British counterparts. This was a prelude to the Greek Civil War. In April 1944, Emmanuel took an active part in the mutiny of Marines and soldiers against the right-wing Greek government being installed by the Allies in Cairo. The mutiny was a protest against the passivity of the government, who did not want to engage the army and navy against the Germans. The revolt began on April 4 in Alexandria. Sailors' revolutionary commissions were formed in support of EAM on 5 Navy ships and in the naval shore establishment. A large part of the Navy and Army units joined it. However, the ships were stormed and recaptured by Greek officers loyal to the government in exile, with the assistance from British military forces. 11 seamen were killed, others wounded, and many were taken prisoner, among them Emmanuel. They were charged with high treason and subsequently sentenced to death by a Greek court-martial in Alexandria. Emmanuel gave a speech in court on behalf of the accused. It is a 17-page-long, passionate apology in which he accuses the accuser of treason against the Greek people and praises the EAM for their heroic struggle. It is not the speech of a frightened young man facing a death sentence, but of an angry revolutionary, gentlemen judges. When this trial began, we had, like you, made the decision not to take part in the debates, not to defend ourselves. We knew that 2 things were going to take place in this trial. A comedy would be played out and a crime would be committed. Both could just as well have been done without us. Why? And despite this, we still agreed to participate in this trial, and if not to defend ourselves, at least to speak. We told ourselves that for us there was one more fight here, and that we know how to fight both, when we have weapons and when we don't. We told ourselves again that we are going to break this monologue. Yes, whether you like it or not, we are going to break it. Whether you like it or not, you will soon be spreading the deep impression that the superb words of little Fornari made on you a few minutes ago, when he shouted to you in his honest and childish voice, "Ni. And if you do not kill me, and if I live another 100 years, and if 100 times the need arises again to revolt and raise arms against traitors to save my country, I will not hesitate to do so." This voice you will have a hard time stifling. You can shut forever the mouth that uttered these words. But tonight and every day when you think of talking about this trial, you will suddenly feel with fear that your aplomb has diminished. You will realize that you are slipping, that you are losing your steps as if you had suddenly entered an unknown, improbable, and incomprehensible territory. For such is the power of truth and moral courage. Change, 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 change. We were accused of having detained 3 warships in the port and thus even indirectly benefiting the enemy. How and why these 3 warships were stopped in the port of Alexandria is known to everyone, and I will explain it to you shortly. But I ask you, who then gives advantage to the enemy? The one who immobilizes 3 warships for 3 weeks, or the one who immobilizes tens of thousands of fighters who asked to be sent into combat for 3 years? And I came to fight also to give something to the total struggle of our people, to the struggle of all people for freedom. And instead of finding the pure air of faith and fraternity of a legion of liberators, I found the infected and suffocating atmosphere of a nursery of praetorians. Instead of finding the anti-fascist army I dreamed of, I found an army infected by a band of political adventurers, fifth columnists and vulgar traitors, who were slowly and systematically carrying out their horrible crime against our homeland. The veil was torn and I saw clearly. I realized in a flash precisely why the Greek armed forces of the Middle East had been created establish a body of mercenary praetorians and thus prepare the dynamic means of their political survival once they arrive in Greece after the liberation. At the top of the conspiracy was a clique of proven fascists who aimed and are aiming at the establishment after the war of a fascist and plutocratic dictatorship with Georges Glicksberg, the son of Constantine the Bosch, at the head. Around them, a clique of bankrupt politicians, long accustomed to getting tangled in the murky waters of petty mayoral politics fast. In its path of betrayal and vassalage, the government of Cairo was moving further and further away from the Greek people. Since the first moments of its creation, the EAM embraced the overwhelming majority of the Greek people, this people thirsty for the fight to leave the conqueror. In no other country, with the sole possible exception of Yugoslavia, has the liberation movement taken on such a universal form. It was no longer the underground action of conspirators, it was the cosmogonic spasm of an entire people who do not accept the chains of slavery. ISSEI. The more the popular revolutionary movement strengthened in Greece, the more asserted the reaction in the Middle East and the deeper the pit of our national split became. The reaction in the Middle East had to lead the fight on two fronts. One, strike, by any means, the popular liberation movement growing in Greece. Two, politically appropriate the Greek forces of the Middle East in order to be sure to use them to impose themselves in Greece when the moment of the final combat with the EAM would come. To achieve the first, she used two means, the conspiracy of silence, collaboration with the invader. Emmanuel and his comrades received the death penalty for treason. However, by the end of 1945, Emmanuel was granted amnesty and instead sent to a British prison camp in Sudan. While in the prison camp, he wrote a textbook on dialectic materialism for his fellow prisoners. For sure, he had become a Marxist. In March 1946, he was released, but with his record and the defeat of the communists in the Greek Civil War, the prospect of finding work in Greece was limited, so he went back to the Congo. In relation to Patrice Lumumba, in the Congo in the late 40s, he directed different commercial and building enterprises. In the 50s, the anti-colonial liberation movement was on the rise in Africa. There was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, Raka Mau Mau Rebellion in 1952-57. The African National Congress organized protests in South Africa, organized protests and civil disobedience up through the 1950s, and Ghana became independent in 1957 with Kwame Nkrumah as president. On the global level, the Chinese Communists had proclaimed the People's Republic of China in 1949, and the Bandung Conference gathering the newly independent countries in Asia took place in 1955. In the Congo, this trend was reflected in the formation of different anti-colonial movements. A prominent figure in this development was Patrice Lumumba. Emmanuel became engaged in Congolese politics, reflected in his articles in the newspaper L'État Livois. These dealt with political and economic questions, which hint at themes later to be developed in Unequal Exchange, 1969, and Profit and Crises, 1974. Emmanuel lived in Stanleyville, which became a stronghold for Patrice Lumumba. On May 22, 1960, Lumumba's party, the Congolese National Movement (MNC), won the first general elections in the country, which was then still known as the Belgian Congo. On June 24, 1960, Lumumba assumed the role of Prime Minister in the newly established government. Independence from Belgium was declared on June 30, 1960, with the country renaming itself the Republic of the Congo that year. Emmanuel became an advisor to the Lumumba government, preparing the economic policy for an independent Congo. A week after independence, on July 6, 1960, Emmanuel held a speech at a dinner party at the Hotel Stanley in Stanleyville, addressed to the provincial president of the MNC. In this quite personal speech, Emmanuel publicly declared his support for Lumumba. I wondered if you have an accurate idea of what the condition of an anti-colonialist white person within a colonial society represents. Rejected by his own clan and unable to enter deep into the indigenous society, where he encounters incomprehension and mistrust, he finds himself in an untenable position, at odds with the world. It is a drama of every day and every moment. The wall of colonialism that stood between you and us prevented our fingers from shaking. Our gaze was not as direct before June 30 as it was after. It was the opaque smokescreen of colonialism that troubled it. If you knew, you who are jubilant today for having been freed from the colonialist yoke, if you knew the joy that is ours, to have been freed from an even more terrible yoke, to have been freed from ourselves, from our complexes, from this inversion of values in which we struggled without a way out, if we do not feel responsible for the specific crimes of colonialism, we certainly feel responsible for its aberration. This monstrous aberration of our Western civilization of the last 3 centuries, which has wasted so many ideals and so much goodwill. I will not sleep peacefully until colonialism is erased not only from the earth, from all lands, but also from the thoughts and memories of men. This is why we are answering your call. The path you have chosen is the right one. Drive out colonialism as an institution. Be understanding of men. Punish, if necessary, the great exploits of the colonialists. Forget the small deeds and gestures of the whites under the old regime, these small miscellaneous facts which constituted the inseparable corollary of a lifestyle imposed by colonialism. In this way, you can count on us. Long live the MNC of the Eastern Province. Long live the Republic of the Congo. The Congo had been declared independent, and Lumumba had won the election and formed a government. But that government surely was not in full control of the state apparatus. On the contrary, Emmanuel's statement had provoked the settler-controlled police and intelligence service. Shortly thereafter, on July 16, 1960, an arrest order was issued for Emmanuel, whereas Mr. Emmanuel Arkiri, born in Patras, Greece, on July 2002, 1911, holder of the status of permanent resident, is undesirable and by his presence and conduct compromises and threatens to further compromise tranquility and public order. Whereas it is undesirable on the basis of information received from the Belgian government and foreign governments, whereas through his subversive activities, his declarations and speeches, he constitutes a threat to the internal and external security of the Republic of the Congo, to tranquility and public order. Whereas in particular, by his activities, he is attempting to place the Republic of the Congo under the direct or indirect domination of a foreign government, that to do so he has, among other things, helped to foment unrest, create and maintain a state of mind in rebellion against legal powers, provoke the excitement of law enforcement against their hierarchical superiors and established powers. Arrest. Mr. Emmanuel Argueri, permanent resident awaiting expulsion, is placed at the disposal of the government for the duration of the expulsion procedure. He will be immediately incarcerated at Stanleyville Central Prison. On the same day, Emmanuel was abducted and deported to Nairobi, together with another Greek citizen, Georgios Giannakis, on a British military aircraft. Simultaneously, the Belgian government declared Emmanuel a threat to public safety. From Nairobi, Emmanuel had to fly to Paris, where he sent a telegram on July 18 to Lumumba, informing him on the arrest, deportation, and his wish to return to the Congo. However, the telegram never reached its intended recipient. Emmanuel subsequently followed up with a letter to Lumumba, dated July 20, 1960, which also got lost. The arrest, deportation, and miscommunications underscore the limited control Lumumba exercised over state institutions at the time. In the chaotic situation developing in the Congo, Lumumba only managed to reply to Emmanuel on November 12, 1960, Georgios Giannakis and Argueri Emmanuel. Gentlemen, your registered letter dated July 21, 1960, reached me only today. I do not understand this long delay. I deeply regret your departure from Stanleyville, a departure provoked by the intrigues of the Belgian colonialists. I know your loyalty to our people and I deplore the humiliating measures to which you have been subjected. I mark my words that you shall return to Stanleyville, where you will only have friends. I will do everything in my power to ensure that you live in the Congo in good conditions. I am looking forward to seeing you again. Please accept, gentlemen, the assurance of my distinguished consideration. P.E. Lumumba, Prime Minister of the Republic of the Congo. With this in hand, Emmanuel tried to get a visa to return to Congo, but no Congolese embassy would issue a visa to him. A few months later, on January 17, 1961, Lumumba was executed by rebels under command of Belgian soldiers. Despite Lumumba's death, further correspondence from the Congolese Central Administration followed. Letters dated February 11, May 2, and December 20 in 1961 invited Emmanuel to return to the Congo. Emmanuel continued to advise the independence movement on economic matters. In his paper dated June 27, 1961, on the Congolese economy's transition from a colony to an independent state, there is the first formulation of unequal exchange. Colonialism maintains the colonized countries in the system of monoculture or some export crops and the extraction of raw materials. This is the clearest part of colonialist exploitation, an exploitation which is carried out not only for the benefit of the colonizer, but on behalf of all the industrial countries. When an industrialized country exchanges its products with an underdeveloped country, it actually exchanges 1 hour of national labor for 5, 10, or 15 hours of labor in the other. This exchange rate in turn prohibits the underdeveloped country from carrying out its own capitalization and emerging from underdevelopment. This cycle must be broken. In Paris, Emmanuel ended up in Paris with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. He had lived in the Congo most of his adult life. It was there that he had his business, his house, and his friends. As late as 1967, he wrote directly to Sese Seko Mobutu, who had become president in the Congo in 1965, and asked for permission to return, but in vain. While in the Congo, Emmanuel had some relation to Paris. From 1957 to 1960, he was enlisted at l'École du Louvre as a student in art history. However, now stuck permanently in Paris at the age of 50, he changed his mind concerning studies, switching from art history to political economy. He entered the École Pratique des Hautes Études to study socialist planning under Charles Bettelheim. Perhaps he had plans to acquire knowledge of economic planning and return to an independent Congo, or perhaps he had developed some ideas on international trade through his business experience on which he wanted to elaborate. The political developments in the Congo were negative. It soon became a neo-colony of Belgium and US mining interests. However, the anti-imperialist movements in general continued their progress in the Third World. The Cuban Revolution in 1959, the Algerian War of Liberation in 1954-62, the victory of the Vietnamese over France in Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the continued liberation of South Vietnam, the resistance against Portuguese colonialism in Africa, and so on. If you were to put pins on a map of the world to show every significant anti-imperialist movement at the time, it would quickly become evident that the prospects were positive in the 60s. This development on the ground was reflected in Marxist theory. Studies of imperialism and anti-imperialism blossomed. One school was dependency theory. It described imperialism as a system consisting of a center or imperial core of North America, Western Europe, and Japan, and an exploited periphery, the Third World, which supplied the metropole with raw materials and tropical agricultural commodities produced by cheap labor. Emmanuel became part of this flux in theoretical understanding. After less than 2 years of studies, in 1963, Emmanuel introduced the notion of unequal exchange in an article. The second publication on unequal exchange, El Intercambio Desigual, appeared in the February 1964 edition of Revue Economica, a Cuban journal. Emmanuel received the doctorate in sociology from the Sorbonne based on his thesis, L'échange inégal, in 1968, the year of the student revolt in Paris. His thesis appeared in 1969 in book form, published by Maspero. In the following years, unequal exchange was translated into English, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Serbian. In the 70s, literally, hundreds of articles in academic journals and left-wing magazines discussed Emmanuel's groundbreaking critique of David Ricardo's classic theory of international trade and its modern versions. A controversial point in Emmanuel's book was the political consequences of unequal exchange. The idea was that the workers of rich countries benefit from the transfer of surplus value from the workers of poor countries. As a result, Emmanuel got many academic relations but few political friends. On the personal level, his life also took a turn in Paris. In 1961, he married Nicole, and they had a daughter, Catherine, in 1971. With his PhD thesis in place in 1968 and its publications by the prestigious publisher Maspero in 1969, Emmanuel's academic career was launched. His career was rather short since he was already 58 years old. He was appointed associate professor at the University of Paris I in 1969. In the same year, he became director of the economics department, UER of Geography and Social Sciences, at the University of Paris 7, and from 1972 he was director at the International Economic Relations Department at the Institute of Economics and Social Development Studies, IED, until his retirement in 1981. After retirement, Emmanuel continued to study and publish on the subject of development and underdevelopment. He especially emphasized the role of the transfer of technology for the development of the productive forces in the Third World. His book, Appropriate or Underdeveloped Technology, was published in French in 1981 and soon translated to English. The book envisioned the rise of China and caused much debate, as Emmanuel stated that multinational corporations' outsourcing of industrial production to the Third World was historically progressive, since it developed the productive forces through the transfer of technology. Emmanuel stated, "Capitalism is bad, but underdeveloped capitalism is worse." A personal tragedy, his wife's sudden death in 1990 at the young age of 53, had a huge impact on Emmanuel in the last part of his life. He died in 2001 and was buried at the Cimetière du Montparnasse in Paris beside his wife. His friend and assistant from the university years, Claudio Jedlicki, and Emmanuel's colleague Serge Latouche held speeches at the funeral. Jedlicki also became caretaker of Emmanuel's archive. At the time, the heyday of neoliberal globalization, few were interested in the political economy of imperialism, and Jedlicki did not manage to find an institution interested in Emmanuel's papers. However, things have changed. In the past decade, there has been a growing interest in Emmanuel's work. In 2021, the Emmanuel Association was established, dedicated to spreading the knowledge of Emmanuel's ideas. The association has a website with articles by and about Emmanuel. In 2024, the association, together with Emmanuel's daughter, Catherine, signed a contract with the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam to host Emmanuel's archive. The course of Emmanuel's life as a political activist and his theoretical academic work reflects the 20th century. His childhood and youth were characterized by wars, fascism, and capitalist economic crises. He spent 19 years of his adult life in one of the most brutal colonial regimes. He took an active part in the national liberation struggle of the Congo, and he lived in Paris during the 1968 rebellion. These first-hand impressions and experiences during the first 50 years of his life were an important basis for the ideas he developed in the latter part of his life. As Mao explains in his essay On Practice, knowing is through perception and experience from lived practice to arrive at the thought, to develop concepts and arrive step by step at the comprehension of the internal contradictions of objective things. It is to develop a logical knowledge capable of grasping the development of the surrounding world in its totality, in the internal relations of all its aspects. The political economy of unequal exchange. Emmanuel's examination of foreign trade and unequal exchange was a direct extension of Marx's Capital. It is firmly based on Marx's perception of value and the accumulation process of capital. Marx had plans to investigate foreign trade more closely in a fourth volume of Capital, but never got to write it. In the preface to his A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, written in 1857, Marx wrote, "I examine the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, world market." Of the planned 6 volumes of Capital, only the first was published during Marx's lifetime. The second volume appeared in 1885 and the third in 1894, both compiled by Friedrich Engels. What is called the fourth volume, Theories of Surplus Value, was edited by Karl Kautsky and published in 1904. Marx's intentions were to conclude the critique of political economy with a volume of Capital which examined the accumulation of capital on the world scale. Unfortunately, Marx did not manage to complete this project. In short, the work Capital as envisioned by Marx is incomplete and, in the later parts, very fragmented. Capitalism cannot be isolated to the sphere of production, which is the focus of the first volume. The accumulation of capital is a process of production and circulation on the global level. Emmanuel picked up this loose thread of Marx's incomplete project. Like Marx, Emmanuel's theory of international trade was based on a critique of the classic political economists, in this case David Ricardo. Emmanuel sought to critique Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, according to which international trade benefits all participants. However, before we turn to how capitalism works at the global level today, we must begin with the Marxist theory of capitalism in general, and in particular the theory of value, since it is upon this foundation that Emmanuel built his theory. Primitive accumulation. Capitalism did not fall from the sky. It grew inside the feudal mode of production, nourished by its contradiction. Marx and Engels write in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, "We see then the means of production and of exchange, on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder." The disintegration of feudalism and the creation of the prerequisites of the capitalist mode of production are referred to by Marx as primitive or original accumulation. Primitive because the birth of capitalism cannot be explained by the law of accumulation of the capitalist mode of production itself. The accumulation of value which constituted primitive capital was not a result of capitalist exploitation of wage labor, but of violence and open theft. In the chapter, the so-called primitive accumulation, in Capital, Marx describes it as the process of creating the basic conditions of capitalist production. At one pole, the creation of free, propertyless laborers, unencumbered with the means of production. At the other, the creation of the owners of money, means of production and means of subsistence, whose only aim is to increase the sum of value they possess. In short, the capitalists. The original capital was generated by the plunder of the colonies in the Asian and American continents, combined with the trade and exploitation of slaves from Africa in the 16th and 17th century. Marx writes, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief memento of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe for a theatre. The different mementa of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now, more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. In England, at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination, embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend in part on brute force, e.g. the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. As primitive accumulation and the exploitation of the colonial areas were a condition of the breakthrough of industrial capitalism, they also created a world system which, from its establishment, was polarized in a center-periphery structure, laying the foundation of the future transfer of value by unequal exchange. The commodity Marxist critique of capitalism is based on an analysis of the commodity. Commodities can be thought of as the cells of the capitalist system. In the commodity, we find the DNA of capitalism. It contains the contradictions that drive the system from a simple exchange of goods in a medieval town square to today's globalized capitalism. In Capital, Marx unfolds the logic of capitalism in increasing complexity, from the commodity cell to the full body of capitalism. The mechanism of unequal exchange does not deviate from the laws of capitalist development put forward in the 3 volumes of Capital, but relies on them and uses them to explain the dynamics of capitalist trade and production at the global level. I will follow how Marx's concept of value unfolds from the contradiction in the commodity to the sphere of nation-states, international trade, and finally to the current form of globalized capitalism. I will focus on how the international transfer of value imperialism became the mode in which the contradictions in capitalism could move ahead, developing the productive forces and giving the system a dynamic development up through the 20th century, and how it is approaching its limits in the 21st century. A commodity is a product of human labor, made by an independent producer with the intention of exchanging it. Immanuel writes, "Behind the comparison between commodities lies hidden a comparison between the different labors needed to produce them. If man ever troubled to compare things so unlike each other as a canoe and cow, it is solely in order to be able to pay as correctly as possible for the labor of those who had produced each of them, when these producers had become independent of each other. Reducing complex to simple labor is not an effect of the market. It results from production carried on with the market in view. It is obvious that without the market, there would be neither abstract labor nor value, but that does not mean that these are determined by the market. A commodity has 2 forms of value: use value and exchange value. Its use value is defined as its ability to satisfy a physical or psychological need, such as a raincoat or a teddy bear. The use value is mainly of interest to the buyer. No matter how different their use value is, commodities have something in common, which makes them comparable on a certain level of abstraction in quantitative terms. This commonality is what Marx calls value, or more specifically, exchange value, to distinguish it from use value. Exchange value is defined as the quantitative relation between commodities no matter how different they are. Thus, for example, one smartphone may equal 20 pairs of sneakers. The exchange relation between different commodities varies according to the circumstances under which the exchange occurs. Commodity exchange may thus immediately appear to be rather accidental. However, this is not the case. What all commodities have in common is that they are produced by human labor for exchange on the market. The exchange value is a manifestation of the value which the commodity has by virtue of being a product of human labor. What is actually compared at the commodity exchange is not the exchange value itself, but the human labor inherent in the commodity. Both use value and exchange value are rooted in human labor. Use value is related to the concrete labor necessary to produce a commodity, sewing, welding, etc. Use value and concrete labor are qualitative in nature and satisfy needs. Exchange value relates to abstract labor, or the consumption of human labor power, which is quantitative in nature, measuring the time, energy, and skills needed to produce the commodity. Of particular importance is the socially necessary labor time, which is the time required to produce a commodity based on the average quality and intensity of labor and the available technology. Thus, abstract labor forms the basis of the value of the commodity, which is compared to the value of other commodities when exchanged. Thus, commodity exchange is not a relation between objects or things. Whether something is a commodity does not depend on certain physical qualities but on the social relationship between seller and buyer. This exchange of values appears to be a relation between things, but it is in fact a social relation between people. Engels writes, "Political economy begins with commodities, with the moment when products are exchanged, either by individuals or by primitive communities. The product being exchanged is a commodity, but it is a commodity merely because of the thing. The product being linked with a relation between 2 persons or communities, the relation between producer and consumer, who at this stage are no longer united in the same person. Here is, at once, an example of a peculiar fact, which pervades the whole of economics and has produced serious confusion in the minds of bourgeois economists. Economics is not concerned with things, but with relations between persons, and in the final analysis between classes. These relations, however, are always bound to things and appear as things. We can neither touch nor see value as such. We can only touch and see the commodities that have value. Value can be measured in labor time or in quantities of other commodities, but it's not a quality physically embedded in commodities. It's not an intrinsic quality which has been injected into the commodity by productive labor. As Marx put it, so far no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The ultimate test of value is the market. Whatever can be sold is a commodity. It has use value for the buyer, and it is on the market that the exchange value unfolds. Value becomes an exchange. Value on the market. In the sphere of production, value is only a possibility. No sale, no value. The term exchange value was not chosen randomly by Marx. The double character of exchange, value. Not only does the commodity have a dual character in the form of use value and exchange value, but exchange value itself also has a dual nature. Its magnitude can be measured in two distinct ways. Externally, it is the market exchange ratio of commodities. Two coats in exchange for a chair, equivalent to, say, $100, a market price. Intrinsically, it is the quantity of socially necessary abstract labor, a number of hours at a certain level of skill. In Marx's famous words, 20 yards of linen, 1 coat or 10 lbs, tea or 40 lbs, coffee or 1/4 corn or 2 ounces gold or 1/4 corn, or 1/2 ounces gold, or W2. The value of a single commodity, the linen for example, is now expressed in terms of numberless other elements of the world of commodities. Every other commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. It is thus that for the first time, this value shows itself in its true light as a congelation of undifferentiated human labor. For the labor that creates it now stands expressly revealed as labor that ranks equally with every other sort of human labor, no matter what its form, whether tailoring, ploughing, mining, and sea, and no matter, therefore, whether it is realized in coats, corn, iron, or gold. These two representations of exchange value, expressed as money, are the price of a commodity and the wage for the labor time needed to produce it. Marx writes, the value, the real exchange value of all commodities, labor included, is determined by their cost of production, in other words, by the labor time required to produce them. Their price is this exchange value of theirs, expressed in money. It is human labor in the production process that is the source of value. However, the specific determination of the actual exchange value occurs on the market. The blood, sweat, and tears of living concrete labor in production is transformed by the process of the market into the dead social objectivity of exchange value, a market price. The fact that all commodities are products of human labor is what makes it possible to relate them to one another. Thus, value reconciles the production sphere and the circulation sphere in capitalist accumulation. Both are necessary for the realization of value. In the preface to the first volume of Capital, published in 1867, Marx announced his plans for 4 volumes, one on capitalist production, one on the circulation of capital, one on the varied forms assumed by capital in the course of its development, and one on the history of the theory. In a letter to Engels dated July 31, 1865, Marx wrote that the volumes were to be considered as an artistic whole. If one only reads the first volume, one's impression might be that production is essential and circulation secondary. However, Marx was very clear about the relationship between production and circulation in the valorization of capital. Capital cannot arise from circulation, and it is equally impossible for it to arise apart from circulation. It must have its origin both in circulation and not in circulation. In the polemic with Charles Bettelheim in the book Unequal Exchange, Emmanuel explains the relation between production and circulation in the process of specifying and distributing value in society. Exchange is not, as Bettelheim supposes, something that complements production at a level external to the latter, and at most a condition for capitalist production. It is an essential moment of this production. Once we assume the existence of private ownership, it is not value that leads to exchange, but exchange that necessarily results in value. Can production be dissociated from exchange? I do not think it can, and I consider that the reproach Bettelheim brings against me, that I situate exploitation in the sphere of circulation and exchange, is ill-founded, since no such spheres exist in reality, and every phenomenon is organically included in the entire system of social production relations, in which production and exchange are inextricably interlinked tini to tu. This surplus product, though the condition and presupposition for exploitation, does not in itself constitute exploitation. The latter begins not with the creation of surplus product, but with its appropriation. Now, appropriation, in the context of the distinction just made, is a matter of exchange, not of production. It begins with the contract for the purchase of labor power, made between the capitalist and the worker. This contract Marx himself describes as an act of exchange. We know at this stage only the worker's nominal wage, whereas exploitation depends on his real wage, which will not be known until after the circulation and realization of the product. After the contract comes the act of production in the true sense. During this act, nothing happens by way of exploitation. The exploitation engendered by the preliminary contract of employment is in suspension, kept on ice, so to speak. Finally comes the phase of circulation and the exchange of the product, in the course of which not only does the subject, the agent of exploitation change, since the surplus value produced is partly transferred from one subject to another, from the industrialist to the rentier, or to the merchant, or to the banker, etc., and also from one branch to another, and from one country to another, but also the volume of exploitation changes, since the total amount of surplus value is modified by the prices at which the workers' consumer goods will be sold. Exploitation is not a fact of production, but of appropriation. The value of labor. Power and surplus value labor is the common measure of the value of all commodities. However, the commodity that is purchased via wages is not an ordinary commodity. To the capitalist, the commodity labor power has one quality which is different from the qualities of all other commodities. The use value of labor power for the capitalist consists of producing commodities whose exchange value exceeds the cost of the labor power required to produce them. In order to exploit labor power in this way, capitalists must own means of production. What the capitalist buys is the labor power of the worker, the strengths, the energy, the knowledge, and the commitment for a specific quantity of time. To maintain this power, the worker needs a certain supply of substances. The value of the labor power is the amount of labor necessary to produce these substances. However, the two quantities, the labor power and its value, are not equal. The labor time and energy the worker delivers are more valuable than the value of the substances the worker needs to be able to deliver the labor power. Just as with other commodities, the value and use value of labor power are different. Labor power's use. Value for capital is its capacity to produce an amount of commodities, the exchange value of which is greater than the exchange value of labor power itself. This difference is what Marx called surplus value, which is the source of profit. For our further investigation, we can divide the workday into two periods, one in which the worker reproduces the value of their labor power, and another in which they create surplus value. The rate of surplus value depends on the extent of the second period. The rate of surplus value, therefore, indicates the level of exploitation of labor power. The rate of surplus value is defined in terms of hours as the time of surplus value divided by the time required to reproduce the value of labor power. Alternatively, the rate of surplus value in terms of money, the universal equivalent for all other commodities, can be defined as the variable capital equals the wage. It is labeled variable because it changes size during the accumulation process. 1 hour of labor can produce commodities that have more value than the value of 1 hour of labor, i.e., than the value of the substances needed to produce 1 hour of labor. But the value of labor is not only measured hours, it is also a question of intensity and productivity, sweat and skills. We have to define those properties. Intensity of labor means the output of a unit of labor with a given set of equipment. It is important not to confuse this concept with productivity, which increases with the increase in the equipment available. New technology. More intense labor produces more use, values and more value. More labor power goes into the commodities. More productive labor produces more use, values, but the same value, the same amount of labor power goes into the commodities. There are basically three ways capital can increase the rate of surplus value and thereby the potential volume of profit. 1. Increase the absolute surplus value by an extension of working time and/or the intensification of work, in relation to the required working hours to reproduce the basket of goods, which forms the value of labor power. 2. Increase the relative surplus value by a productivity increase as a result of new technology or more effective management forms, which reduces the necessary working hours for the reproduction of labor. Share of the total working hours. 3. Extract super surplus value by lowering the value of the wages below the level of reproductive costs, even beneath the subsistence level, and thus the necessary working time. Share of the total working hours. The concept of super-exploitation originates from Rui Mauro Marini, a Brazilian economist known as one of the creators of dependency theory. In his book, Dialéctica de la Dependencia, he describes how the breakthrough of industrialization in England in the 19th century was dependent on imports of cheap food products produced through the super-exploitation of labor in countries such as Ireland and the countries of Latin America. This export-oriented capitalism in the periphery created a dynamic capitalist development in the center and underdevelopment in the periphery. Marini defines super-exploitation as CE, the intensification of work, the extension of the working day, and the expropriation of part of the labor necessary for the worker to replenish his labor power, CE. In capitalist terms, these mechanisms, which moreover can and usually do occur in combination, mean that labor power is remunerated below its value, and thus amount to a super-exploitation of labor. The intensification and extension of the working day equals Marx's absolute surplus value. However, it is the last form in the list, the expropriation of the labor needed for replenishment, which is of special interest here. Marini is referring to wage depression in the colonial areas to below the value of labor power, when he mentions expropriating the part of the labor necessary for the laborer to reproduce his labor power. Marini furthermore draws the interesting conclusion that the super-exploitation of labor power in the periphery changes the pattern of the extraction of surplus value in England from being dependent on absolute surplus value, longer and more intensified labor, to relative surplus value, greater productivity, due to the dynamic development of industrial capitalism in the second half of the 19th century. Marini writes, Beyond facilitating the quantitative growth of these countries, Latin Americans' participation in the world market will contribute to shifting the axis of accumulation in the industrial economy from the production of absolute surplus value to that of relative surplus value, that is, that accumulation will come to depend more on increasing labor's productive capacity than simply the exploitation of the worker. It is this contradictory character of Latin American dependency which determines the relation of production of the capitalist system as a whole that should draw our attention. The development of the productive forces in the center, due to colonial super-exploitation, increased the relative surplus value considerably. However, the working class in the center managed to get its share of the gains from the increased productivity by raising their level of wages through class struggle in the second half of the 19th century. In a letter to Samir Amin, Emmanuel wrote, "I note in passing and with pleasure a sentence on page 121 where you state that the rate of surplus value measures the relationship of power between the workers and the capitalists. This is my most intimate conviction." On page 51, you say that monopoly makes the phenomenon of the labor aristocracy possible. I don't know what you mean exactly by that. On page 85, you return to this subject by speaking of mechanisms which enable monopoly capitalism to ensure a continuous growth of wages at the centers. If you mean to say that not only do the external surpluses enable the monopolies to provide this growth, but that the monopolies as such react in a more realistic and positive way than competitive capitalism to workers' demands, it seems to me that this is indeed correct. There is no necessarily built-in relationship between a rise in productivity and an increase in wages. Who gains is a question of class struggle. I will return to the importance of super-exploitation as a generator of surplus value in contemporary global capitalism based on low-wage labor arbitrage. First, however, I will address the relation between the value of labor power and the development of highly differentiated wage levels in global capitalism. The price of labor power. The wage labor power is not like other commodities. There is no factory that produces labor power. Labor power does not produce labor power. Labor power is generated in the private sphere of society mostly. The commodity that capital purchases for the wages is not the worker's labor, but the labor power, the skills and energy that enables the worker to produce commodities for a certain number of hours. In order to gain and regain these skills and energy, the worker needs to consume a certain basket of commodities produced in the capitalist sphere. In addition, an amount of service such as care, cooking, and cleaning is provided by the household. The value of this basket of commodities and services defines the value of labor power. However, the value that labor power produces in the form of commodities is not equal to the value of commodities in the basket. The labor time a worker can put in is longer than the time needed to produce the commodities the worker must consume in order to perform this labor. The difference constitutes the source of profit realized by the sale of the commodity on the market. But what defines this basket of goods and how is its price, being also the price of labor power, the wage determined? Marx distinguished between two factors determining the value of labor power: the bare reproduction costs of labor power and what he called the historical and moral element. The bare reproduction costs of labor power relate to the costs that are necessary to keep the working class alive, fit to work, and able to have children who become new workers. In simple terms, they are the costs necessary for food, clothes, and shelter. When a worker receives a wage that covers only the bare minimum of what is necessary to reproduce the ability to work, it is often called a subsistence wage. This was basically the wage paid up until the mid-19th century. It could vary because of natural conditions, such as climate, soil fertility, and so on, but it was more or less the same globally. However, the development of industrial capitalism in Europe, in combination with the European colonial empires and the large-scale trade union struggle, broke that pattern. In addition to the basket of essentials, Marx added the historical factor, the number and extent of his so-called necessary wants, as also the modes of satisfying them, are themselves the product of historical development and depend therefore to a great extent on the degree of civilization of a country, more particularly on the conditions under which, and consequently on the habits and degree of comfort in which, the class of free laborers has been formed. In contradistinction, therefore, to the case of other commodities, there enters into the determination of the value of labor power a historical and moral element. Nevertheless, in a given country, at a given period, the average quantity of the means of subsistence necessary for the laborer is practically known. In other words, the historical and moral element of the value of labor power is a product of class struggle, national and international, historical and current. This class struggle and its entire historical and economic basis determines the wage level, and through this process also the level of surplus value, which depends on the value of labor power, and hence the profit rate for capital. The long history of capitalism, the creation of a world divided into a center and periphery by colonialism and imperialism, together with the limited international mobility of labor, helps explain the development of differences in wages globally. In the imperialist core, the price of labor power, the wage, is relatively stable over time within a specific country. There are norms, rules, laws, and union regulations about the length of the working day, working conditions, overtime, minimum wages, piece rates, etc., which makes the variability of wages comparatively limited. A similar tendency cannot be seen internationally. The relative stability of the wage levels in time and their variation with place in the world system stands in contrast with the price for other commodities, which varies significantly over time but is relatively stable from place to place. The prices for copper and wheat, for example, go up and down almost daily, but they do so across the world. There is a world market price for most commodities, with labor power as a significant exception. Within countries, especially imperialist ones, there is a tendency for wages for the same kind of work to balance out. Globally, however, the differences remain huge. Emmanuel writes, from remotest antiquity to the beginning of the 19th century, the wage has, in real terms, hardly varied in any country. From the beginning of the 19th century up to the present, it has, in certain countries, moved slowly and steadily upwards. Such a constancy in certain periods or certain countries, such an evenness and duration of a one-dimensional movement in certain other periods and other countries are contrary to the endogenous economic determinations which are plastic and multiform. An extra economic institution vector alone can generate them. At any rate, on the international plane, the multiplicity of wage rates is inconsistent with the existence of a market, since the essential function of the market is precisely to secure one price for each item. Now, in the case of wages, this disparity continues without the slightest attenuation, even when, here or there and in certain epochs, the labor factor enjoys a relatively important mobility. Neither the great immigration of Europeans into the United States during the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, nor the contemporary considerable immigration of North Africans, Portuguese, Greeks, etc., into the developed countries of Western Europe after the last war have given rise to the slightest tendency towards the equalization of wages between the countries of origin and the host countries. There is no relevance between the conjunctural fluctuations of employment in different countries and the comparative rates of wages in these same countries. For example, during the 1929-34 crisis, unemployment in the United States was 36.47% of the active population against 13.42% in France and only 7% in Italy. Yet the American wage remained, during the worst of the crisis, 2 to 3 times that in France and 3 to 4 times that in France and 3 to 4 times that in Italy. We can conclude that the determination of wages is more political than an economic process. Its variations reflect the fluctuations of the relations of power between social classes. This extra economic institutional determination makes possible a lasting gap between the price and value of labor power. However, these two magnitudes continue to be connected to each other in a dialectical interaction. A wage greater than the value of labor power, if it prevails for a long time, ends by driving upwards this value itself, since the extra consumption which it allows ends by being transformed into vital needs, what Marx calls a second nature, and hence by being incorporated into the real cost of reproduction of the labor force. The moral and historical element in the determination of the value of labor power is sometimes used to explain the difference in wages on the global level. However, there is no moral component which legitimizes a higher wage for the workers in Europe than for the proletariat in the Third World. If the difference between wages at the Volvo factory in Gothenburg in Sweden and Durban in South Africa is due to a historical and moral component, then the history is colonialism and imperialism, and the moral component is racism. The globalized value of labor power. As mentioned before, Marx never gave a coherent and comprehensive account of the theory of value and the formation of wages at the international level, although he considered it an integral part of the critique of political economy. When Marx formulated his conception of the historical and moral element of the value of labor power, capitalism consisted of rather distinct national economies. Up through the 20th century, a global market of trade and capital investment developed, and under neoliberalism, production itself became globalized, linking labor power in the North and South together in production chains under the command of multinational firms. With the industrialization of the global South in the past half-century, the level of technology and management regimes has also become increasingly similar on a global level. The value of a commodity is based less on varied and isolated national conditions. The value is based on global conditions. Thus, labor power also has a globalized value. Amin writes in his 1973 article, The End of a Debate, the essential contribution made by Emmanuel is undoubtedly the discovery of the preeminence of international values. Our world longer consists of juxtaposed national systems carrying on external relations with each other, even if these are important, as was the case until quite recently. Rather, it constitutes a unity, a whole. The world capitalist system, SEE, Emmanuel has gradually drawn these conclusions. The system is defined in the abstract by the great mobility of goods and capital, and by a relative immobility of labor. This means that commodities are not first of all national commodities, and then exceptionally or marginally international. On the contrary, it means that commodities are primarily worldwide wide. A nice eyes, we are among those who consider that the publication of Unequal Exchange by Alkiri Emmanuel marks an important date in the theory of international trade and, beyond that, in the theory of unequal relations of domination dependence between the center and the periphery of the world capitalist system. The fact that Emmanuel's argument was rejected out of hand by conventional economists is quite understandable, since the Ricardian theory of international trade is consistent with the subjective theory of value. In fact, that was the only exception to Ricardian internal logic, based on the labor theory of value, as Emmanuel was the first to point out, and very clearly. The development of a global value of commodities and labor opposed to different national values is an important question in the political economy of imperialism. Samir Amin explains the formation of global values in The End of a Debate in a very accessible way, so I will quote him at length. Within Emmanuel's context, in which the capitalist mode of production governs the specific activities of the partners, capital mobility shows a tendency towards equalizing the profit rate throughout the world, while remunerations to labor, which is immobile, vary from one country to another according to historical conditions. Hence, the transformation of international values, the only meaningful ones, into international prices, again, the only meaningful ones, implies the transfer of value from some nations to others. Since all products are international commodities, the same quantity of labor used up in different parts of the world and incorporated in the products also gives rise to a single world value, although labor power is not an international commodity, as it does not move beyond national boundaries. Emmanuel is quite right in stressing this point. The labor hour of the African proletarian is equal to that of the European proletarian, since the product of the labor of either one are international commodities. In reply to Palouik, who is surprised at the comparison of the value generated by an hour of labor in the two places, Emmanuel says, how does one compare an hour of African labor with that of a Detroit worker? Well, in the same way that one labor hour of a Detroit worker is compared with the labor hour of a New York barber's, Prive. At this stage, we simply want to show that the assertion of the preeminence of international values is the very essence of the theory in question. Emmanuel's critics have in fact clearly noted this, and it is precisely this preeminence that they question or categorically reject. On this point, Padua writes, is there an international value which is the basis of world prices? In the same way as there is a national value, Emmanuel assumes that the world is the only reality. On the contrary, it seems that the only reality is the existence of economic blocs, USA, Europe, Asia, Latin America. And Bettelheim writes, within every national capitalist social formation, the law of value ensures the extended reproduction of the material conditions of production, the specific form of domination by the capitalist mode over the other modes, Suenation, a given level of wages. In the capitalist world market, the law of value guarantees the extended reproduction of the material conditions of world production, the specific forms of domination, a subordination of the different social formations, the unequal rates of development. Ninth, the level of wage peculiar to each social formation cannot be determined by the world level of development of productive forces. In fact, it is basically related to the specific combination of productive forces production relations peculiar to each social formation. The position here is quite categorical, and it seems to us to be mistaken. Further on, we shall show how we deal with the dialectic between world level and national levels of development of productive forces, and how we use this dialectic to determine the wage at the center and at the periphery of the system. In any case, this position nullifies the question to be solved. If we follow Bettelheim in accepting that wages are autonomously determined in each social formation, we can no longer have a theory of international trade. We must then accept Ricardo's theory of comparative advantages, i.e., make an exception to the labor theory of value. It is not even possible to speak of the effects of the law of value at the world level. This is no longer meaningful, and we can no longer speak of international commodities. In the last analysis, this position means regarding the world system as a juxtaposition of national systems. Each of the latter being autonomous, it is clear that their trade relations cannot be analysed in objective terms, but must be seen in terms of subjective theory, which can here be applied, as opposed to the national context which is governed by objective value. This position was certainly not one adopted by either Marx or Lenin. In fact, Marx considered that the import of American wheat in England in the 19th century lowered the value of labour power in that country. Hence already he regarded subsistence foods corn as international commodities. Precisely for this reason, Marx considered that the development level of world productive forces, a development which made it possible to obtain wheat more cheaply in the New World, determines the wage and the rate of surplus value in England. Similarly, Lenin clearly upholds the preeminence of the world system. This is reflected in his praise of Bukharin's work. Bukharin's shortcoming was not that he gave preeminence to the world system, but that he made the mistake of characterizing this system, like the capitalist mode of production, by the triple international mobility of commodities, capital and labor, the tendency towards the equalization of the wage rates which we have pointed out. In other words, Bukharin regards the world system as an extension of the capitalist mode of production on a world scale, hence its tendency to uniformity. The preeminence of world values therefore constitutes the very essence, the core of the affirmation of the unity of the world system, the condition for this unity. The adjective international derived from the economic theory of international trade is indeed inappropriate and should be replaced by the word world. Unity has never been synonymous with homogeneity. There is diversity and inequality within the unity of the world. Things seem to be clear-cut at the center of the world capitalist system. Social formations are close to the pure capitalist mode of production. At its periphery, the preeminence of world values is overshadowed by the apparently heterogeneous nature of social formations, only apparently, since here again, there is no juxtaposition of the capitalist mode with the pre-capitalist modes. The nucleus of the problem is to understand the meaning of the domination by the capitalist mode over the other modes, the domination being the basis of this unity. But this analysis does not derive from economies, but from historical materialism. It is through the alliances among classes peculiar to each formation and to the world system that this integration within the unity of the world takes place. There is perhaps a reason for this persistent dualistic vision, to which in contrast we present the unity of the world system. The fact is that this unity is very recent. It is true that the roots of the world system go back to the beginning of mercantilism, 4 centuries ago. It is true that the system's contribution was accelerated twofold by imperialism as from the end of the last century. However, the process of transformation of the relations between the capitalist mode and the other modes of production, which were originally periodic and marginal, upon the emergence of domination relations which have radically altered the non-capitalist modes and have reduced them to a simple form, as shells whose content has since become a relation of sale of labor power, is a process which was at first slow, but recently quickened its pace. It is possible that in the 30s, the producers at the periphery were still largely small commodity producers. We are convinced that they are no longer so, and that today they are mostly proletarians and sellers, although indirectly, of their labor power. 1,000 social facts prove it every day. There are certainly important errors of political strategy arising from this inconsistency between the present reality and the picture which is still based on the reality of yesterday. In his 2010 book, The Law of Worldwide Value, Samir Amin still considers this his major contribution to the political economy of imperialism. My major contribution concerns the passage from the law of value to the law of globalized value. Based on the hierarchical structuring, itself globalized, of the price of labor power around its value. This globalized value constitutes the basis for imperialist rent. It is crucial to distinguish between the value and the price wage of labor power. As mentioned, labor power is not an ordinary commodity produced by capital, but one generated in complex social relationships. Its value is determined by historical development, as well as the contemporary class struggle, family structure, and so on. This means that labor power is reproduced under very different conditions in the South and North, but it is nevertheless brought together through global production and consumption. The port worker who loads containers in Shanghai creates as much value as the port worker in Rotterdam who unloads them, assuming that the work has the same intensity and uses the same technology. However, the price of labor power, the wage varies due to the different historical backgrounds, different social relations, political conditions, and the limited mobility of labor, as Amin writes. Capitalism is not the United States and Germany, with India and Ethiopia only halfway capitalist. Capitalism is the United States and India, Germany, and Ethiopia taken together. This means that labor power has but a single value, that which is associated with the level of development of the productive forces taken globally, the general intellect on that scale. You have to be consistent. You cannot invoke inescapable globalization when it suits you and refuse to consider it when you find it troublesome. However, though there exists but one sole value of labor power on the scale of globalized capitalism, that labor power is nonetheless recompensed at very different rates. The bare reproduction cost and the historical and moral component of the value of labor power are not two distinct, isolated, and different elements. The class struggle may incorporate new elements in the bare reproduction cost, and repression can pressure the wage below that level. The wage may vary below as well as above this global value of labor. The combination of the historical development of highly different wage levels between the global North and South and the constitution of a global value of labor power has several consequences. It entails different rates of surplus value. The combination of globalized value and low wages in the South is the basis of the extraction of what Marini calls super surplus value, which generates super profits for capital and relatively low commodity prices for a North wage level. Thus, the difference between the value of labor and the price of labor causes a transfer of value from the South to both capital and labor in the North. As capitalism has developed over centuries in the process of colonialism and the formation of a center-periphery world system, capital accumulates on the global level. In this way, value and its mediations, in prices of production and market prices, increasingly become the ground on which market exchange is generalized globally. During 50 years of neoliberalism, capitalism advanced the global law of value concerning commodities, while simultaneously fostering mechanisms that violate and negate it concerning one specific commodity, the wage, the price of labor power. Through this, capital can produce by using low-wage labor in the global south and sell the resulting commodities to high-wage labor in the global north. Super exploitation is a violation of the global value of labor power, which leads to unequal exchange at the expense of low-wage countries. This anomaly is a necessary condition for the accumulation processes of world capitalism. It is thus not an accidental feature, but instead is reliant on sustained political suppression of labor movement in the periphery and restrictions on the international movement of labor. Hence, we see the development of a global law of value of goods and labor. However, the price of labor, the wage, varies due to the history of class struggle. It is the class struggle in capitalism, dividing the social product into profits and wages, which is the driver in the development of unequal exchange. The core of the theory of unequal exchange is the Marxist concept of value. The depression of wages in the periphery by colonialism and imperialism and the rise of wages in the center by successful trade union struggle based on colonial exploitation are the basis of unequal exchange. The international law of value, combined with the history of colonialism, is the key to understanding the exploitative relations between the center and the periphery, relations which are hidden behind the appearance of the price structure of commodities in the world market. The central point is not the exchange on the market, but the difference between the global value of labor and the local prices of labor power. So, what is the global value of labor power in terms of size? As Marx explained in the quote above concerning the value of labor power in a country, the necessary wants are themselves the product of historical development, then depend on the degree of civilization. Nevertheless, W at a given period, the average quantity of the means of subsistence necessary for the laborer is practically known. If we apply this to the global level, we can determine the global value of labor power as the global average wage at a given time period. The average wage is calculated according to the number of workers on certain wage levels in all parts of the world, taking into consideration skill and intensity of the labor power. I will return to the specific size in the next chapter. A given level of wages compared to the global value of labor power indicates whether you are in the center or periphery of the world system. Historically, the difference in wage levels between center and periphery has steadily widened. Around 1800, wages around the world were at more or less subsistence level. Today, in 2025, the difference in wages between the USA and China is around 6-1 and between Sweden and Bangladesh 50-1. Following this discussion of the value and price of labor power, I return to the transformation of value into commodity prices and the transformation of surplus value into profit. The first step is the formation of the cost price. The individual capitalist is not interested in surplus value and the rate of surplus value, but in how much profit the total amount of invested capital yields. Therefore, what actually interests the capitalist is the wage and other costs of production. Marx writes, the value of every commodity produced in the capitalist way is represented in the formula V equals C plus V plus S. If we subtract surplus values from this value of the product, there remains a bare equivalent or a substitute value in goods, C mean Os PT. This portion of the value of the commodity, which replaces the price of the consumed means of production and labor power, only replaces what the commodity cost the capitalist himself. For him, it therefore represents the cost price of the commodity. How this cost price is distributed between constant C and variable V capital does not interest the capitalist. To him, the profit is the yield of the aggregate capital, surplus value, in its assumed capacity as the offspring of the aggregate advanced capital is converted into profit. It should be noted that it is the wage and profit rate which determines the cost price and not the other way round. Emmanuel observes, wages are differentiated by geographical areas and independently of ups and downs in commodity prices. They are rigid and remarkably stable in time. During the last 20 years, the price of coffee, copper, and sugar has fluctuated in a range of 1 to 3 and sometimes even more than that. No corresponding change or anything like it has been recorded in the wages paid in the countries producing these goods. All through these evolutions and even revolutions in prices, the worker in Guinea, Uganda, Brazil, or Katanga has gone on receiving his subsistence wage, which can be estimated, without much margin of error, at 5 cents an hour, whereas his American or European counterpart has in the same period been earning 20, 30, or 40 times as much, depending on the particular country, and not at all on the movement of prices. During the same period, the capitalist in Guinea, Uganda, Brazil, or Katanga had, of course, his ups and downs. Yet, taking one year with another, he ended up with something not too far from the average international rate of profit. In the days when wages varied from one country to another only as 1 to 2, or even 1 to 3, or 1 to 4, it was perhaps legitimate to suppose that fluctuations on the commodity market could be the underlying cause of these variations. When, however, wages vary at the rate of 1 to 20 or 1 to 30, and vary only in space while possessing extreme rigidity in time, in which only a slow and linear trend is to be observed, with hardly any variation, we are indeed compelled to recognize that they probably vary in accordance with laws peculiar to themselves, and that, consequently, they really are the independent variable of the system. The circulation of capital. Let us take a look at the full circle of capital accumulation. The capitalists invest partly in buildings, machinery, raw material, etc. In short, in the production apparatus. This part of the capital is called constant capital because it does not change in value during the accumulation process. The capitalists also invest partly in labor power. This part of the capital is called variable capital because it forms the basis of the creation of new value in production. Thus, the factors of production which the capitalist acquires by investments are divided into two main parts, which both are equally vital: variable capital and constant capital. The circulation of capital can be divided into the sphere of production and the sphere of circulation. In the latter, commodities are bought and sold. Both spheres are dependent on one another. There is no circulation without production, and there is no point in producing without circulation. The concept of value unifies the production and circulation spheres, which are both necessary in capitalist accumulation. For sure, the labor power in the sphere of production is a precondition for surplus value, but the commodities have to be sold on the market to turn the surplus value into profit, the accumulation of capital. The concept of unequal exchange is often criticized for focusing on circulation, international trade, instead of the sphere of production, where the exploitation of labor is assumed to take place. However, this perception is wrong, both regarding the theory of unequal exchange and the Marxist theory of exploitation in general. Emmanuel writes in a polemic with Charles Bettelheim, "Exchange value S is merely a phenomenal form of values created in production, appearing at the level of circulation and accompanying the commodity as an intrinsic quality, like a substance that has, so to speak, been injected into the commodity by productive labor, CEEEEEE. Exchange is not, as Bettelheim supposes, something that complements production at a level external to the latter, and at most a condition for capitalist production. It is an essential moment of this production. Once we have assumed the existence of private ownership, it is not value that leads to exchange, but exchange that necessarily results in value." The first phase of the circulation of capital consists of capitalists acquiring means of production and buying labor power. The second phase consists of using the means of production and the purchased labor power to produce commodities. The third phase of the circulation of capital consists of trading commodities. In this phase, the capitalist collects the surplus value created in the production process as profit. The capitalist must be able to sell the commodities that have been produced on the market at a price that includes both the expenses for constant and variable capital plus the surplus value, which can then be used either to start the circulation of capital anew with expanded possibilities or for consumption. In Marx's words, the conversion of a sum of money into means of production and labor power is the first step taken by the quantum of value that is going to function as capital. This conversion takes place in the market, within the sphere of circulation. The second step, the process of production, is complete so soon as the means of production have been converted into commodities whose value exceeds that of their component parts and, therefore, contains the capital originally advanced, plus a surplus value. These commodities must then be thrown into circulation. They must be sold, their value realized in money, this money afresh converted into capital, and so over and over again. This circular movement, in which the same phases are continually gone through in succession, forms the circulation of capital. Although the price of a commodity can differ from its value, it is determined by the value in the final instance. According to neoclassical market economists, prices are determined exclusively by supply and demand on the market. This is, however, only the final touch. Commodities need to be produced and reproduced to keep accumulation running. If capitalists do not recover the cost of production, plus a profit on the market, they will not produce the commodities again, and accumulation ceases. The price they need is what Howard Nicholas calls reproduction prices. The size of this price cannot be determined by market forces, since the formation of the market price is what we want to explain. Freya Brown formulates the problem nicely. We cannot use prices to measure inputs, for prices are what we are trying to explain in the first place. The only thing common between all the inputs of a commodity is labor. Thus, in any economy based on commodity production, the prices of commodities will in the final instance be fundamentally tied to the socially necessary labor time embodied in those commodities. Let us see how surplus value and value is transformed into profit and market prices. From surplus value to profit. Just as the worker is interested in the size of the wage more than in the concept of value, the capitalist is interested in profit more than the concept of surplus value. Profit, as we have seen, is dependent on production costs in general, or what is called the cost price. The relation between the surplus value S and the total capital C used for production defines the profit rate P prime, expressed as P prime equals S divided by C. The profit rate depends both on the rate of surplus value and on the relation between constant and variable capital. A rise in surplus value brings a rise in the profit rate. The relation between constant and variable capital is labeled capital's organic composition. It depends on the ratio between the amount of labor power and the means of production. This relationship varies from industry to industry. The organic composition is low when variable capital makes up a large part of total capital, and it is high when constant capital makes up a large part of total capital. An example for an industry with a high organic composition of capital is the petrochemical industry, which relies largely on constant capital. An example of an industry with a low organic composition of capital could be nursing or the care service industry, which relies relatively largely on variable capital. There is an immediate relation between capital's organic composition and the profit rate. The higher the organic composition, the lower the profit rate. The lower the organic composition, the higher the profit rate. Formation of the average rate of profit. As we have seen, capital investments of the same size but with different organic compositions can, in theory, generate very different rates of surplus value and therefore very different profit rates. However, this is not what happens in practice. If it were, capital would flock to industries with a low organic composition, yet this is not the case. We know that the average long-term profit rates of different industries are very similar, but why? Capital always moves toward industries that promise the highest profits. If there is increased demand for the products of a certain industry, their prices will rise and so, in turn, will the profit rate. This attracts capital formerly invested in other industries and leads to the growth of this particular industry. Often the consequences are overproduction and oversupply, falling prices, a lower profit rate, and capital moving elsewhere. Unequal profit rates between different industries cause the constant movement of capital and balance out the rate of profit between different industries to reach an average. In other words, competing capitals ensure that the average, long-term profit rates of different industries are very similar. This also means that a given amount of capital will, in the long run, create similar profits no matter what industries it is invested in or how it is divided between constant and variable capital. This can be explained through the first step of the transformation of value into price, the conversion of the value of commodities into a price of production. The price of production of a commodity consists of the cost price, variable plus constant capital, plus the average profit in relation to the total capital used in its production. This can be summarized in the following formula. Price of production equals cost price plus the result of total capital invested multiplied by the average rate of profit. The price of production of a particular commodity is not the same as its value. At first glance, these two categories might seem the same. However, the formation of the average profits leads to a transfer of value between different production spheres with different organic compositions and hence different relative sizes of the surplus value. However, the combined price of production of all commodities is the same as the combined value of all commodities. In addition, combined profits are the same as the combined surplus value created in production. The price of production must not be confused with the market price, to which it is only sometimes coincidentally equal. The market price is the price a commodity is actually sold for on the market. Market prices are adjusted by supply and demand, the existence of monopoly, and so on. The goal for each commodity is to reach a market price that consists of its cost price times the average rate of profit as a share of total capital. This allows production, and therefore the accumulation of capital, to continue. When profits are distributed, surplus value is transferred from industries with a low organic composition to industries with a high organic composition. This is of no relevance for capitalists. However, for a Marxist analysis of capitalism, it is important to account for this transfer. Some Marxist economists have called this transfer unequal exchange in the general sense, but this must not be confused with Emmanuel's use of the term. To speak of unequal exchange in this context can be misleading. The value transfer described above is inherent in the logic of capital. The fact that the profit rate is distributed among all industries so that capitalists can make profits in each of them, whatever the organic composition of capital is a structural necessity in capitalism. It allows capitalists to compete in the market and to develop the productive forces. If commodities were priced according to their value, instead of according to the price of production, investments in mechanization would come to a halt. Capitalists would only invest in labor-intensive industries with greater variable capital and a low organic composition. The transformation from value into market price. In the transformation from value to price of production and then to market price, we can conclude that value is not linked to the specific commodity, a substance injected in the production process and then in some way transmuted into price of production. This perception of value as a sort of physical thing in itself is a common misconception even in Marxist circles. However, this is not the case. Value is a social relation which unfolds itself in different forms, in the interaction between seller and buyer on the market, between different capitals, and between national economies in the capitalist mode of production on world scale. Inside a developed capitalist country, labor is mobile enough to guarantee that the rate of surplus value will be similar across different industries. The market prices of commodities depend on the price of production, where the profit rate is equalized, not on the cost price. Market forces provide a final adjustment based on the current supply and demand of the commodity. We can conclude that it is not the supply and demand on the market that determine the size of profits and wages, but the opposite. It is the wages and profits which are the independent variables in the system, and these determine the prices of commodities. Andrea Ricci emphasizes the relation between labor power and final market price through the concept of exchange. Value. The dual nature of abstract labor is reflected in the dual nature of the exchange value. As exchange value created in production, hours of work, and exchange. Value realized in circulation, as the market price, which manifests itself in the real confrontation occurring in the process of market exchange between seller and buyer concerning supply price and demand price, the real cost of production, and the final price of the commodity. Andrea Ricci adds, the former labor time is hidden and invisible inside the production process, while the latter appears in the form of the market price of commodities. In their equivalence, the socially necessary labor in production and the socially necessary labor in circulation are reunited, defining the magnitude of value of the commodity as a given quantity of objectified abstract labor. The appropriation and distribution of value. The transformation of value into price occurs on the market, in other words, in exchange. If we look at value only in the realm of production, we turn value into an essence that flows from the minds and bodies of workers into the specific commodities they produce. But, as we have seen, value is the result of social relationships. Exploitation occurs throughout the entire circulation of capital, that is, during the production of commodities as much as during their exchange. Surplus value is created in production, but it is acquired and distributed in exchange. It is in exchange that human labor appears as the only possible measure of the different commodities, that is, as the basis of value. It is the sphere of circulation, the market, that distributes the value created by human labor between industries, countries, and individuals. Among capitalists, the average rate of profit balances out. Value is transferred from industries with low organic composition to industries with high organic composition. Finance and trade capital can acquire value without being involved in production at all. Between capitalists and workers, the distribution of value follows a simple principle: profit for the capitalists and wages for the workers. Value is moved and allocated because of competition and class struggles, national and global. As Marx put it, from the possibility that profit may be less than surplus value, hence that capital exchange profitably without realizing itself in the strict sense, it follows that not only individual capitalists but also nations may continually exchange with one another, may even continually repeat the exchange on an ever-expanding scale without for that reason necessarily gaining in equal degrees. One of the nations may continually appropriate for itself a part of the surplus labor of the other, giving back nothing for it in the exchange, except that the measure here is not as in the exchange between capitalist and worker. At this point, I would like to draw attention to deviations in the transformation of value into price, and hence the realization of profit at an average rate. In real existing capitalism, we can observe differences in the rate of profit. Certain sectors and firms can get extraordinarily high profits, super profits. Statistics on international rates of profit are rather problematic. This is partly because the information on which the statistics are based is unreliable, as tax and bookkeeping conditions may lead to the rates of profit quoted not being in accordance with the real rates. In addition, detailed information is seldom found in the statistics regarding how the rates of profit that are quoted have been calculated. However, the available statistics, although vitiated by uncertain factors, mainly confirm the tendency to an equalization of profit laid out by Marx in Capital as a general rule in the capitalist mode of production. Capital is attracted to sectors and markets where profits are high and moves out of sectors and markets with low profit rates. This tendency is strengthened by the mobility of capital. However, it is countered by different forms of monopoly in technology and market access. In his writings on imperialism in 1916, Lenin spoke of super profits, meaning profits substantially over the average profit in a given time period. The basis for this divergence was colonialism and monopoly capitalism. Monopolies take different forms. Some have to do with the production sphere and monopolistic ownership of a certain technology that produces a commodity more efficiently, protected by patent and copyright laws. Others have to do with the circulation sphere, branding, a certain privileged access to a market or raw material that others do not have. Some have to do with being a first mover, for example, outsourcing production to a low-wage country in the 1980s. Monopolists get super profits by selling commodities for more than their price of production, i.e., the price that equalizes the rate of profit at the expense of lower profits for the other capitalists. English capital had already gained super profits in the second half of the 19th century through its monopoly on industrial production and on colonial trade in many regions of the world. Marx writes about super profits on the international and national level. Capitals invested in foreign trade can yield a higher rate of profit because, in the first place, there is competition with commodities produced in other countries with inferior production facilities, so that the more advanced country sells its goods above their value even though cheaper than the competing countries. Insofar as the labor of the more advanced country is here realized as labor of a higher specific weight, the rate of profit rises because labor which has not been paid as being of a higher quality is sold as such. The same may obtain in relation to the country to which commodities are exported and to that from which commodities are imported. Namely, the latter may offer more materialized labor in kind than it receives, and yet thereby receive commodities cheaper than it could produce them. Just as a manufacturer who employs a new invention before it becomes generally used undersells his competitors and yet sells his commodity above its individual value, that is, realizes the specifically higher productiveness of the labor he employs as surplus labor. He thus secures a surplus profit. The advantage of having a new technology or being a first mover on the national level is temporary. However, super profits on the international level in connection with imperialism seem to have remained as a constant feature. Marx explains in the following passage, as concerns capitals invested in colonies, etc. On the other hand, they may yield higher rates of profit for the simple reason that the rate of profit is higher, they're due to backward development, and likewise the exploitation of labor, because of the use of slaves, coolies, etc. Why should not these higher rates of profit, realized by capitals invested in certain lines and sent home by them, enter into the equalization of the general rate of profit and thus tend, pro tanto, to raise it, unless it is the monopolies that stand in the way? There is so much less reason for it, since these spheres of investment of capital are subject to the laws of free competition. The favored country recovers more labor in exchange for less labor, although this difference, this excess, is pocketed, as in any exchange between labor and capital, by a certain class. Lenin took up in 1916 where Marx left off. Super profits have not disappeared, they still remain. The exploitation of all other countries by one privileged, financially wealthy country remains and has become more intense. A handful of wealthy countries, there are only 4 of them, if we mean independent, really gigantic, modern wealth. England, France, the United States and Germany have developed monopoly to vast proportions. They obtain super profits running into hundreds, if not thousands, of millions. They ride on the backs of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people in other countries and fight among themselves for the division of the particularly rich, particularly fat and particularly easy spoils. In the Second Congress of the Communist International, Comintern, in 1920, Lenin went as far as to state, super profit gained in the colonies is the mainstay of modern capitalism. Samir Amin spoke of generalized monopoly capitalism in the 70s, when referring to capitalism's current phase. When he speaks of monopolies, it is not just corporations dominating industries. It means networks that dominate the entire productive system. Small and medium-sized firms serve as suppliers to the monopolized production chains, which take a significant share of their profits. The profits made by Foxconn from the production of Apple products between 2005 and 2015 amounted to between 2 and 3% of the sales price. The profits made by Apple were 30%. Another example is the many textile factories in countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Eritrea, which produce for the fabric-less brand companies like Nike, Adidas, H&M, Zara, and Hugo Boss. Suppliers in Global South often produce exclusively for a particular corporation in Global North. If that corporation threatens to relocate its production, the supplier is likely to go out of business. It is easy to understand the pressure that can be exerted. Emmanuel was of the opinion that an equalization of profit rates take place not only at the national level, but also on the global level. In contradistinction to the lack of mobility of labor, the mobility of capital is sufficient to generate a tendency towards the equalization of its rate of remuneration. In his model of value transfer through unequal exchange, he also assumes an equalization of profit rates. The reason he assumes this is to keep all factors except the wage equal, to emphasize the effect of a rise in wages in one country. However, it is not a prerequisite for a value transfer by unequal exchange that the profit rate is equalized, as Emmanuel writes. It follows that to refute the theory of unequal exchange, it is not enough to show that there are monopolies and that the rates of profit are unequal. It must be shown too that there exists an inverse functional link between the rates of wages of one region and the rates of profits of the same region. We have no reason to believe in the existence of such a function. S par, the as, whereas the wages run apart along national lines, profits run apart mainly along different lines per industry or branch, irrespective of the proportion in which these industries or branches are introduced in the different countries, and there is no precise relevance between the rationale of variations of relative levels of wages and that of variations of relative levels of rates of profit rates gap. As deep as one of wage rates and especially of a profit rates gap being systematically correlative to the wages gap. This allows us to rule out the idea either that the circumstances which depress the wages in a country could tend to depress the profits too, or that the low wages of certain countries entail constantly and systematically higher profits in these same countries. EAD disparity in the rates of profit, even if they move in the right direction, are of another order of magnitude than the disparities of wages, so that it is excluded that the one offsets or diminishes the others. The profit rate is not determined in a specific firm, but in a wider context at the global level. Today, international trade is not just an exchange of commodities produced by capitalist firms in different countries, as was primarily the case when Emmanuel formulated his thesis in 1969. With the globalization of production in the form of outsourcing and transnational production chains, the controlling brand firm, located in the global north, gets a higher profit rate than the producing firms further along the chain in the global south. In this case, the inequality of exchange not only is not reduced, but is in fact aggravated, since the global north charges its sales not only with its super wages, but also with its super profits. There is no theoretical reason why the imperialist transfer of value, based on low-wage labor power, cannot take place both in the form of super profit to capital and as cheap commodities to consumers in high-wage countries. The division of social product in profits and wages is determined by class struggle on the national and international level. However, let's continue the examination of the generation of prices of commodities and labor power in the capitalist mode of production. Value as price. Historically, money emerged as the necessary intermediary of exchange in the marketplace long before the breakthrough of capitalism. However, it is first in capitalism that the exchange of commodities through the use of money is generalized in society. Marx, in his analysis of money and capital, first assumes that gold is the money commodity for the sake of simplicity. Gold and silver coins represented only a first stage of the historical development of money in capitalism, followed by paper notes and credit money. Marx was fully aware that money as a medium of circulation can just be a symbolic commodity, devoid of any intrinsic value, representing a given amount of value by social recognition in the form of guarantees from the national bank. The so-called gold standard, the possible exchange between banknotes and an amount of gold to guarantee their value, was the basis for the international monetary system from the 1870s until 1971, when the United States unilaterally terminated the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. The advantage of using gold instead of paper money or plastic cards in Marx's analysis is that in a unit of gold we can still recognize the measure of the abstract socially necessary labor time for its production. For example, 1 ounce of gold equals 100 kilograms of wheat in terms of labor power. Money, in the form of metal pieces, paper notes, or plastic cards issued by banks, has a production cost close to nothing. But the national bank guarantees that you can exchange your money with commodities on the market. This guarantee is built on trust in the banks and in the performance of the national economy in general. In terms of the price of a commodity, we again see the two sides of exchange value. Andrea Ricci sums it up. In a capitalist economy, therefore, money simultaneously represents the visible mode of appearance of both measures of the exchange, value of a commodity, directly as extrinsic measure and indirectly as intrinsic measure. In other words, both the market exchange ratio of one commodity with other commodities and the abstract labor time objectified in them appear in the exchange in the form of a given amount of money. Until now, we have assumed that the two forms of measurement of exchange value, first as the price of commodities at the market and second as the labor time it took to produce them, were equivalent in terms of exchange. But what if the price of labor power is determined in a different way than the price of the commodities they produce? What if the wage is determined on the national level and commodity prices are determined on the global level? It is only with the formation of international trade and production that the law of value reaches its final stage, as Marx writes in Theories of Surplus Value. But it is only foreign trade, the development of the market to a world market, which causes money to develop into world money and abstract labor into social labor. Abstract wealth, value, money, hence abstract labor, develop in the measure that concrete labor becomes a totality of different modes of labor embracing the world market. Capitalist production rests on the value or the transformation of the labor embodied in the product into social labor. But this is only possible on the basis of foreign trade and of the world market. This is at once the precondition and the result of capitalist production. Let us see how the law of value works out at the global level. Unequal exchange. As mentioned above, Marx never properly outlined theories of the world market and international trade. But there are fragments in Capital which indicate what effect a possible differentiation in wages between countries could have upon international prices. In Volume 1, Marx mentions that the value of labor power varies not only in time, but also between different countries as they have a different historical element. However, in a given country, at a given period, the average quantity of the means of subsistence necessary for the worker is also given. From the middle of the 19th century onwards, we see a difference developing in the subsistence necessary for the worker between the center and periphery of the capitalist world system. Such a difference has consequences on the prices of commodities, as Marx writes. In the case of a partial or local rise of wages, that is, a rise only in some branches of production, a local rise in the prices of the products of these branches may follow. We have here Marx's indications of what can happen in international trade. However, the first coherent theory of international trade in the spirit of capital was formulated 100 years later by Augury Emmanuel. Emmanuel referred to value transfer from one country to another as unequal exchange on the world market. The basis of unequal exchange is the historically constituted difference in wage levels between the imperialist countries and those which were then called the Third World. Colonialism engulfed the planet, according to Emmanuel, by expanding international trade through importing raw materials and agricultural products and exporting industrial goods, and this developed into an ongoing unequal exchange of value. The supply of cheap agricultural products and raw materials, for example cotton, from the colonies in the second half of the 19th century made it possible for English capitalism to reduce the value of its workers' labor power, reduce the cost of reproduction of labor power, and thus increase surplus value, profit, while, at the same time, increasing their wages, the price of labor power. In turn, this favored the dynamic mode of capital accumulation in the imperialist center, which was dependent on the expanding consumption power of the working class. By contrast, super-exploitation, the remuneration of labor below its value, reproduction cost, became the model used by capital in Latin America, Asia, and Africa in the export sector, supplying raw materials and food to the imperialist center. The capitalist in the periphery was not dependent on the consumption of a domestic market, as long as Northern and Western Europe and the United States demanded their production. Hence, super-exploitation became the most prominent way of increasing profits in the reproduction of capitalism in the periphery of the world system. Marini's concept of super-exploitation in the colonies and Emmanuel's explanation of the wage rise in the imperialist center as the drivers of unequal exchange between center and periphery supplement each other nicely. Both Marini and Emmanuel see the deviation of the wage from the value of labor as the generator of unequal exchange. By the 1880s, the unequal relationship between the center and periphery had been cemented. While only subsistence wages were being paid in the latter, wages became significantly higher in the former. This was a result of two simultaneous processes: the struggle of the working classes in the center for better pay and living conditions, and the oppression and exploitation of those in the periphery. Let us see what different wage levels mean for the formation of prices of production. Inequality of exchange results from the difference between the international value created by domestic labor in the production of exported commodities and the international value realized in money from their sale on the world market. On the import side, it is the difference between the international value created by foreign labor in the production of the imported commodities and the sum of international money given in payment for them by domestic purchasers. Therefore, transfers of value in international trade derive from the difference between value created in production in one country and value realized in circulation in another country. On exploitation, the values of commodities is measured in terms of quantity of labor, which takes place in the sphere of production. However, the appropriation of value takes place in the sphere of circulation through exchange on the market. Exploitation is an appropriation of other people's labor. This is true whether it is a person's exploitation of another person or one country's exploitation of another. The products of human labor are commodities or services and, therefore, the appropriation of human labor is the appropriation of these commodities and services. Consequently, all exploitation between countries is ultimately based on an unequal exchange of commodities and services. This may either be reflected by a deficit in the balance of trade, which means that the imperialist country imports more commodities than it exports according to current world market prices, or by inequality in the actual price formation. As Emmanuel argues, to simplify still further, one country can only gain something at the expense of another by taking more goods than it provides, or by buying the goods it obtains too cheaply and selling those it provides at too high a price. It is no accident that the US has the largest trade deficit in the world, $773.4 billion in 2023.4 billion in 2023. In a developed capitalist mode of production, the transfer of value takes different forms. As we have seen, value is transferred from lines of industry with a low organic composition to lines with a high organic composition. Finance and trade capital can gain value without even being directly attached to the sphere of production. Value is transferred from countries with a low wage level to countries with a high wage level. All these transfers of value can only be understood if capitalist circulation is considered as a whole. The basis of the surplus value, the surplus labor, is performed in production, and the appropriation and distribution of the surplus value take place in the trade in commodities. Because exploitation through unequal exchange takes place in the interactions on the world market, the smaller industrial countries in the core, like the Scandinavian countries that lacked colonies, could join in and ride on the wave of the big colonial powers. Denmark connected to the British Empire in the second half of the 19th century by delivering agricultural products to the British working class. Sweden linked to Germany by delivering raw materials such as iron, copper, and timber to the rapidly expanding industrial power. Through the movement of capital and goods between the colonial powers and the other industrial countries, each of them got its share in the worldwide unequal exchange. The share of the cake did not depend on the size of imperial possessions, but on the industrial potential and wage levels in each of these countries. We have only to compare the standard of living of Sweden, Denmark, and Canada on the one hand with that of Portugal, Italy, or even France before World War II on the other. This is also why this dismantling of colonialism after the Second World War was not the end of imperialism, but its expansion. By the middle of the 20th century, the anachronistic character of colonialism, under pressure from the United States to free international trade, had rendered it obsolete in this form. The former colonial empires adjusted themselves to the new situation without too much grief, letting the economic laws of international trade attribute to each of them the benefits of unequal exchange. The fact that a person takes part in production as a wage laborer does not necessarily mean that the person is exploited, or that the worker cannot exploit other people. Wage labor is a sine qua non of capitalist exploitation, but it is not enough. The exploitation depends on the actual ratio between the necessary labor, the wages, and the surplus labor, the surplus value. Thus, if you can appropriate more value by buying commodities with your wages than the value you produce as a wage worker, you are not being exploited, but you are exploiting. If we take the global perspective, in principle, there is nothing new about this. In Grundriss, Marx deals with the fact that laborers could benefit from other laborers' products being sold below their value to the extent that these products were part of their consumption. Engels did not doubt the possibility of the British proletariat exploiting the colonial proletariat. The English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeoisie. For a nation which exploits the whole world, this is of course to a certain extent justifiable. And in a letter to Kautsky he wrote, "You asked me what the English workers think about colonial policy. Well, exactly the same as they think about politics in general, the same as the bourgeois think. There is no workers' party here, you see. There are only conservatives and liberal radicals, and the workers gaily share the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies. Thus, the fact that wages of a certain size can contain more value than the labour performed in order to get those wages is not something new. It is a question of calculations, not of principles." As mentioned above, Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange has been criticized for focusing too much on the circulation of goods and disregarding production. But the theory concerns more than just trade. It points to the heart of the conflict between capital and labor, which is reflected in the global differences in wages and differing degrees of exploitation. Emmanuel knew very well that the basis for value was created in production, but it is in exchange that value is realized. Exploitation is the result of the full circle of capital accumulation, which encompasses both production and circulation. No interpretation of Marx's theory of value can disregard the role of the market in the transfer of value. It is through the market that value is acquired and distributed, both between different capitals and between capital and labor. Emmanuel adapted the theory of value to international trade, something that most of his critics have not even tried to do. However, the development of capitalism continued with a new division of labor and the globalization of the production process itself. Neoliberal lessons for dependency theory. When the political group I belonged to, Communist Working Group, was studying unequal exchange in the late 1970s, we were wondering why capital did not move much more industrial production to the global south to take advantage of low wages. We discussed this with Emmanuel in 1982, who cited several practical, technical, cultural, and political reasons. Transport and communications barriers posed huge obstacles to manage and control production at a distance. The trade unions in the center still had the strength to resist outsourcing, and the social democratic-led states had the ambition to regulate multinational companies. The polarizing dynamic in global capitalism from the second half of the 19th century and up through the 20th century led the dependency theorists of the 1970s to conclude that the industrialization of the Third World was impossible within the imperialist system. They assumed that a substantial domestic market for consumer products had to be developed before a substantial industrialization could occur. Third world countries had to delink to unblock the development of their productive forces, as Russia in 1917 and China in 1949 had tried. Third world countries would continue to supply raw materials, tropical agricultural products, and simple, labor-intensive industrial commodities. Their economies would remain dependent, and they would continue to constitute the periphery of a world system still dominated by capitalist states. However, the development of the production forces and capitalism's need to expand accumulation changed all that. History moves in leaps. Capitalist development knocked down the barriers to industrialization of the global south. Its need to expand and its hunger for profit led it to outsource industrial production on a massive scale from the global north to the global south. Neoliberal globalization. Emmanuel began to develop his ideas of unequal exchange while living in the Congo from 1937 until 1960 and formulated his thesis in the mid-60s. However, from the late 70s and over the next 3 decades, a transformation of historical dimensions of the international division of labor took place. It not only changed and expanded international trade, but also globalized the capitalist production process itself. Neoliberal globalization was based on the development of the productive forces in terms of information handling and communication, computers, cell phones, etc., new management forms, and the huge reduction in transport costs because of the introduction of the standard shipping container. These developments of the productive forces made it possible to control and manage production globally. The distance between the place of production and the market became less relevant, and hence also the need for the geographic proximity of a high level of consumption to generate or sustain an industrialization process. The political side of this transformation of the global division of labor was the introduction of neoliberalism, a showdown with the attempts of the state to control capital. Transnational capital is not detached from the nation-state. Nation-states provide political and military means for national bourgeoisies to compete with one another in the struggle over global market share and investment opportunities. In the 60s, capital concentration reached a point where the revenue of some corporations exceeded that of smaller nation-states. The pressure on capital culminated in the early 1970s with the oil crisis and stagflation. This crisis revealed that Keynesian methods were no longer effective in protecting the nation-state from economic crises. However, capitalism was still a vital mode of production and was not out of options to expand. If millions of people in the Third World and the socialist bloc could be firmly integrated into the capitalist labor force and world market, imperialism could be reinforced. This required a weakening of the nation-state and the social state. This was the reason behind neoliberalism's attack on the social state and trade unions in the 80s. Neoliberal political leaders, such as Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in Britain, launched an all-out attack on government regulation. They ensured capital's free mobility, privatized the public sector, and limited trade union power. They demanded a shift from the social state to the competition state. From the very beginning of industrial capitalism up to the 1970s, the countries of the periphery mainly served as sources of raw materials and tropical agricultural products. In the 1950s, industrial goods made up only 15% of the exports of all third world countries combined. By 2009, the number had risen to 70%. Industrial production had, at a rapid speed, been moved from the global north to the global south. The liberalization of goods, labor, and capital markets has contributed to the emergence of a new model of organization of production on a global scale. This new industrial paradigm has replaced the old vertical and spatial integration of production with a new horizontal integration under the control of large multinational corporations, based on the dispersion of the manufacturing cycle between firms and countries around the globe and aimed at minimizing costs. In total, the global labor force engaged in capitalist production rose from 1.9 to 3.1 billion people between 1980 and 2011. 3/4 of this workforce live in the global south. Together, China and India account for 40% of the world's labor force. In 2010, there were 541 million industrial workers in the global south, while only 145 million remained in the global north. The center of gravity for global industrial production no longer lies in the global north, but in the global south. Agriculture in the south has also undergone big changes. Agricultural production has been integrated into the global market, and a new rural proletariat has emerged. These products are now available in all shapes and forms year-round for customers in the north. 80% of the workforce in this so-called non-traditional agricultural sector consist of women. Outsourcing is not limited to industrial and agricultural labor. It is also a major factor in the service industry. Services that can be moved are moved. Mumbai, for example, has become the global center for IT services. Labor costs for an Indian software engineer, programmer, or data assistant are a fraction of what employers would have to pay in North America or Europe. In the 1990s, it became popular to describe Western societies as post-industrial. We are a far cry from a post-industrial world. However, computers, screens, smartphones, and all the other consumer goods we use in ever-increasing quantities are produced by actual people. Globally, there are more industrial workers today than 4 decades ago, not less. While the labor is done in the South, it is still controlled by the North, which handles finance and trade and enforces property rights. Global production chains. In the 19th century, goods were typically produced within a factory, where raw materials were turned into a finished product. Today, the journey from idea to finished product happens increasingly along global chains of production. Each step in the production process is moved to where conditions are best for the corporations involved. The first links in the chain, finance, research and development, and design, are placed in the center, which also controls the overall process. Production takes place in a multitude of factories in peripheral countries, where labor costs are low. The final stages, branding and marketing, are done in central countries where a major portion of the products is sold. A good example of a so-called fabless, no fabrication company is Apple. Apple develops, designs, and sells products, but outsources all of the manufacturing. On the back of iPhones, one can read, "Designed by Apple in California, assembled in China." The parts for Apple products are produced across Southeast Asia. They are then shipped to Shenzhen in China, where the Foxconn company owns gigantic factories. In the Longhua factory, 400,000 Chinese laborers work, sleep, and eat, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Apple executives in California call Foxconn's factory town Mordor, after the ghastly region in Lord of the Rings. If we follow the chain of production further, we find Congolese miners working under lethal conditions to retrieve the minerals used in electronic components. The Congolese miners, the Chinese workers, and the California executives are all connected by chains of production, yet their standards of living are worlds apart. Global chains of production can be roughly divided into 2 categories. Producer-driven chains, like the automobile industry where parts come from, many countries and are assembled just in time, and consumer-driven chains, the trademark of global supermarkets and big fashion brands like Nike and H&M. The brand company from the north has the power to put pressure on the producing company in the south and appropriate a bigger share of the profit. Globalization of production has changed the structure of international trade. It has been estimated that transnational corporations' networks of production accounted for roughly 80% of the tenfold increase in international trade between 1980 and 2007. The current industrialization of the South cannot be compared to the industrialization of Europe and North America more than a century ago. The industrialization of the North was made possible by tariff barriers, a strong domestic market, colonialism, and imperialism. The current industrialization of the South is entirely dependent on exports and characterized by fierce competition. The workforce of the South faces a large reserve army of labor and migration laws that restrict their movement. It is impossible to export the goods produced in the South for low prices to the North and establish a consumer society in the South at the same time. The low wages of the South require the creation and maintenance of a large reserve army of labor. Labor arbitrage. The globalization of production is characterized by the outsourcing of production to low-wage countries, a process termed labor arbitrage. Arbitrage allows a corporation to make a profit by buying cheap labor power on one market and selling the products on another market where wages are higher. Labor arbitrage takes 2 forms. First, production is moved to low-wage countries. Second, labor is imported from low-wage countries. The first is by far the most important because the mobility of labor is limited by migration laws. However, sectors such as agriculture and construction do what they can to import cheap labor. Migrant workers are brought into the country when they are needed and sent away when they are not. The skylines of Dubai and Qatar have been built by workers from Bangladesh, Nepal, and the Philippines. The migration of labor power adds to unequal exchange in 2 ways. First is the import of the commodity of labor power, with the poor country footing the bill for its upbringing and education. This implies that remittances do not represent a north-south subsidy, but precisely the opposite, a south-north subsidy. Second, forms of labor migration take the difference in wage level with them. Historically, European settlers took their high wage levels with them. In contrast, migrants from the periphery to the center received much lower wages than the homegrown labor force, a difference upheld by racist structures. Unequal exchange concerns the difference between the global value of labor and different wage levels. The global value chains. In neoliberal economic theory, the formation of the market price along a production chain is visualized as a happy, smiley curve. In the first steps design, R&D in the north, costs are high, so there is much value added, the curve starts high. When the chain moves to the south production, costs are low, so little value is added, and the curve falls. Finally, when the product returns to the north marketing, branding, the curve rises again as costs are high. This curve only reflects market prices, not the labor power it takes to produce the product. If we apply Marx's conception of value, the curve looks like a sour-faced smiley, the exact opposite. The reason labor in the global south is much cheaper is not that it creates less value, but that laborers in the south are more oppressed and exploited. Bright and dark value. Donald Cleland distinguishes between bright value, accounted costs visible in bookkeeping, and dark value, invisible, unaccounted costs such as underpaid labor and environmental externalities. GDP figures are a veil concealing north-south exploitation. If GDP measured actual production, Bermuda and Liechtenstein would be among the most productive countries. The basis of the high GDP in the global north is the capture of dark value, hidden from economic accounting. This includes undercompensated formal labor, unpaid inputs from households, cheap natural resources, and ecological externalities. Cleland has studied the value transfer in the production and sale of Apple products. In 2011, an iPad in a US store cost $409. Production costs were $275, resulting in a $224 profit for Apple. Of the production costs, $150 went to development and marketing in the north, $92 for components, and $33 to Foxconn for assembly in China. Foxconn paid roughly $8 per unit in wages. If we took GDP at face value, we would conclude that the value of an iPad comes from US designers. However, it is obvious that Apple's profits are based on low-wage labor in the south. Value captured is a much more accurate term than value added. In 2011, had an iPad been assembled in the US, Apple would have paid $178, not $33. Furthermore, companies like Apple avoid climate-related costs by moving production to places with weak environmental laws. Cleland calculated that Apple saves about $30 per iPad in environmental fees by producing in the global south. He concludes that the total dark value of an iPad is no less than $472. Producing it in the north would almost double the production costs and sales price. Consumers in the global north benefit from the exploitation of workers in the global south. For what they make in 1 hour of work, consumers in the north can buy commodities whose production requires numerous hours of low-paid labor and environmental destruction. To sum up, capitalism must be analyzed in its global accumulation process. The contradiction in globalized capitalism is between the imperative to expand production for profit, creating exchange value, and the lack of consumption power created by the same production seeking use value. This contradiction generated overproduction crises in the 19th century. The development of unequal exchange, the transfer of value from the periphery to the center, became the temporary solution allowing capitalism to expand as a polarized world system into the present day. Let's proceed by seeing how we can measure the transfer of value by unequal exchange on a global level. How to measure unequal exchange. In 1979, my group, the Communist Working Circle, wanted to estimate the magnitude of the unequal exchange. The study of the price of labor in the world was the starting point for our calculations. We began by investigating the differences in wages between imperialist and exploited countries. We collected data for about 100 countries by using the Yearbook of Labor statistics from the International Labour Organization and various other sources. We looked into the hourly wages of industrial and agricultural workers in the late 70s. It is evident that such investigations are vitiated by errors and uncertainty, but other studies and our own experiences from travels in the Third World confirmed the main results of the investigation. If we use the figures and weigh them with the number of industrial workers in the countries in question, the average figure representing the wages of the industrial workers appears as about 5.63 US dollars per hour in imperialist countries and about 0.46 US dollars per hour in third world countries. In 1979, it was impossible for us to find reliable figures for the number of agricultural workers in most countries, and as many of the wage figures for agricultural workers do not represent the real remuneration, we chose to estimate the ratio of the number of industrial workers to agricultural workers and the ratio of the wages in industry to agriculture. Our results suggested a ratio of industrial workers to agricultural workers of 18:1 in imperialist countries and 1.3:1 in exploited countries. The ratio of the wages of industrial to agricultural workers was 1.4:1 in imperialist countries and 2:1 in exploited countries. Thus, the average wages of both industrial and agricultural workers could be calculated as $5.50 per hour in imperialist countries and $0.36 per hour in imperialist countries. Thus, wages were, in general, 15 times higher in the imperialist countries than in the exploited countries. We use the ratio 15:1 as a conservative estimate. Several things indicate that the difference in wages might have been greater. The wages which are actually paid in poor countries are often lower than the ones stated due to sheer evasion of agreements and legislation on the part of the employers. Furthermore, the statistics often only apply to organized laborers. In many imperialist countries, the employer pays insurance and pensions which are not paid directly to the workers. These amounts ought to be considered as part of the wages in such calculations. The value of labor power. However, the measurement of the value of labor power is more complex than just measuring hours. There are also questions concerning the intensity of the work and the productivity of labor in relation to its creation of value. The wages paid to the industrial and agricultural workers in the exploited countries are often not enough to cover the physical reproduction costs of the labor power. The high intensity and long working days, often 10 to 12 hours in sweatshops, have the consequence of a rapid attrition and change of labor power. A rate of change of 50 to 100% annually is not abnormal within industries and plantations in the Third World. Within the electronics industries of Asia, for example in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and Taiwan, young female laborers are preferred. They are able to work harder and longer hours, up to 60 hours weekly. After 3 or 4 years of back-breaking work at the microscopes, they are worn down and they are fired, or as it is called, encouraged to retire and marry. New and fresh labor power is then employed. In most of the countries where free production zones and world market factories are in operation, the standard working week is 48 hours. The high number of weeks worked in the year, the large amount of overtime, and the low number of days off serve to prolong the total annual working time. Workers in some South Korean factories work 84-hour weeks, that is, a 12-hour shift each day without rest days. In the Thai manufacturing industry, a 9-hour working day with only 1 day off per month is often required. Conditions have not changed since the late 70s. The intensity of labor in the global south is not less but higher than in the global north, and that is part of the unequal exchange because higher intensity work creates more value. Productivity. One of the most popular explanations of the international wage differences is that they are based on similar differences in productivity. The argument is that the wage is low in the global south because the workers are less productive. This explanation is used as an objection against the theory of unequal exchange. This line of thinking leads to making the proletarians of the rich countries appear to be exploiters of the poor ones. In reality, some argue these workers are more exploited because of the high level of intensity and productivity of labor in the rich countries. Their wages, though nominally higher, correspond to a smaller proportion of the value these workers produce. According to this logic, the more productive forces are developed, the more the proletarians are exploited. Despite their low wages, the workers of the underdeveloped countries are supposedly less exploited. This argument rests on several misconceptions. First, one has to distinguish between productivity and the intensity of labor. Bourgeois economists focus on output per worker, either in the form of the number of goods they produce or in the form of profit made from their labor. To bring more clarity to these issues, I offer the following definitions. Intensity is the rate of consumption of labor power. Higher intensity means a faster wearing out of the laborers and more produced commodities per unit of time by the same means of production. Productivity is determined by the efficiency of the technological facilities and by the organization of production. Improving the technology while keeping intensity the same results in a production of more commodities per unit of time. Both increased intensity and increased productivity results in the creation of more use, value per unit of time, but only increased intensity creates more value per unit of time. Increased productivity just means the production of a greater quantity of commodities with the same overall value. Improvements in productivity are a result of improved technology of the capitalist production apparatus. Gains from improvements in productivity go to the capitalist as profit. The value and payment of the labor power do not depend on whether the laborer operates an expensive, highly productive plant or a screwdriver. With equal qualifications, any difference in productivity can only result from an improved tool or heavier equipment. But since profits are proportionate to the capital invested, this equipment has already weighted the selling price of the product by a sum which the system considers to be strictly equivalent to its differential contribution. To try to increase it by the difference in salaries as well is to try to obtain payment for the same thing twice over. The productivity of the laborer's work does not influence his wages. If we assume that productivity affects wages in an upward direction, it would be difficult to understand why the working class in the third world does not benefit from the productivity increase to the same extent. What determines the wages is the class struggle and the possibilities of wage variation which the international position of the national economies can offer. Concerning the differences in global productivity, many studies from as early as the 70s showed that the rate of productivity defined as output per head was by and large the same in the world market industries in the third world and in the rich countries. The multinational company Philips concluded that the productivity is more or less the same in these areas. Other studies concluded that the rate of productivity of the industries in third world countries which have turned their production towards the world market is only a little lower than the rate of similar industries in Western Europe. In light of the longer working hours in the third world, the workers have a much higher rate of performance. According to studies made by the United States Tariff Commission, the rate of productivity of workers in American-owned enterprises outside the US is by and large the same as the rate in the same industries in the US. Workers in the clothing industry in exploited countries produce just as many units per hour as their American colleagues do. Certain studies even concluded that the rate of productivity of industries in the exploited countries is higher. In the electronics industries, the Mexican rate of productivity was found to be 10 to 25% higher than in the US. As the rate of productivity measured in units produced turns out to be the same or higher in the exploited countries, it is often due to much higher labor intensity. Very often, many manual operations are mechanized or automated in the imperialist countries. This means that laborers in the third world have to work much more intensively to achieve the same rate of productivity. If working processes have not been mechanized in this part of the world, it is only because the wages are so low that it currently would not be of any advantage to the capitalists to proceed with mechanization. All these examples refer to the situation in the 70s. Today, after the outsourcing of most industrial production to the global south, we can ask, how much value do millions of workers in China contribute to the iPhones they produce? According to mainstream economists, the answer is very little because the labor costs make up only a small fraction of the sales price. However, capital goes where the value is. If one accepts the logic that Chinese workers add little value because they are paid very little, then value is mistaken for price, and productivity is defined as value added per working hour. Recent studies show that there is no correlation between high wages and high productivity. Internationally, the car industry in Mexico has the highest productivity, while productivity in Germany is the lowest. In the textile industry, both Brazil and Thailand have higher productivity than the US and Germany. This confirms that the global differences in wages cannot be explained by differences in productivity. Other factors are much more important: restrictions on the mobility of labor, an enormous reserve army of labor, and political power structures. Unequal exchange has nothing to do with the exchange of goods produced with low technology against goods produced with high technology. High-tech textile factories in Egypt and India or mines in the Congo suffer from the inequality of exchange despite their high productivity. Conversely, certain stagnant branches in developed countries, such as Scottish whisky or semi-artisanal fabrics, benefit from the same inequality despite a low level of productivity. What the employer buys is not the labor, but the labor power, which is neutral vital energy. Its value is already constituted before we even know where its purchaser is going to use it, in the handling of $1 million press or a handcart. The increase in productivity is the result of the competition between capitalists. They are constantly forced to improve the productive forces to produce at the lowest price. The result is that the industries in the global south began to outstrip industries in the global north, first in shipbuilding and textiles, and then in all industrial sectors. Economists have called it social dumping when low-wage industries crush the industries of the rich countries. There is a hypocrisy in this argument. When rich countries import coffee or bananas at low prices, no allusion to low wages is allowed. But when poor countries export cotton goods or transistors, it is discovered that the rich countries should make up for the difference in wages through artificial tariff barriers. This is the argument used today against electric cars, solar panels, and windmills produced in China. The size of the unequal exchange. Having determined the global differences in price of labor and the global value of labor, we can turn to the exchange of commodities on the world market. One country can only exploit another by importing a total value of commodities which is higher than the value of the exported commodities. This may take place through a distortion of the actual prices at which the commodities are sold. The imperialist countries sell their commodities at prices which are too high compared to their value, and the exploited countries sell at prices which are too low. Imports by imperialist countries from the Third World amount to about 1/4 of their total imports, or about 4 to 6% of their national product. This relatively small quantity could lead one to believe that the importance of trade with the Third World, and thus of the unequal exchange, was comparatively small. But the opposite conclusion should be drawn. Unequal exchange is based on the disproportionately low prices of commodities from the Third World, which are also the reason for the disproportionately low trade figures. The argument that small trade figures demonstrate that unequal exchange is unimportant shows that the theory has been misunderstood. About 70% of the exports of the Third World are sent to the imperialist countries. Internal trade between the countries of the Third World amounts only to about 25 to 30%. Thus, the imperialist countries import by far the majority of the cheap commodities from the Third World, benefiting from unequal exchange. Similarly, 60 to 70% of Third World imports come from the imperialist countries. In the beginning of the 80s, the international division of labor was very different from today. The predominant exports from the Third World were still raw materials and agricultural products, while the imperialist core exported industrial products in return. Inter-imperialist trade was, to a large extent, an exchange of the same type of products, mainly functioning to expand choices regarding shape and color. The imperialist core was qualitatively dependent on imports from the Third World for agricultural products, raw materials, and minerals necessary for their industrial production. The European Economic Community at the time was 100% dependent on imports from developing countries for copper, manganese, coffee, cocoa, bananas, spices, and rubber. With these trade figures, we can estimate the size of unequal exchange in a single year, 1980. This is meant as an illustration of the approximate size. In 1980, the exports of the exploited countries to the imperialist countries amounted to $39.15 billion, and exports from the imperialist countries to the exploited countries amounted to $293.4 billion. Assuming that wages amount to 20% of the price of the products from imperialist countries and 15% of the price of the products from exploited countries, the wage share amounts to $58.7 billion in both cases. According to the International Labour Organization, there were about 400 million people engaged in active employment in the imperialist part of the world and about 800 million in the non-socialist part of the Third World. If we assume that wages in the imperialist countries are 15 times higher than wages in the exploited countries, we can set the wage factor in the exploited countries to 1 and in the imperialist countries to 15. On this basis, the average global wage factor is calculated by taking 400 million workers at factor 15 and 800 million workers at factor 1, totaling 800 million units. Dividing this by the total of 100 million workers gives an average global wage factor of 5.7. If workers in exploited countries were paid this global average wage factor of 5.7 instead of 1, the wage share of their exports would be 334.7 instead of 1. The wage share of their exports would be $334.7 billion. Meanwhile, if workers in imperialist countries were paid this global average wage factor instead of 15, their wage share would be $22.3 billion. These wage shares are then added to the remaining production costs. The resulting hypothetical export prices would be $675 billion from exploited countries and $207 billion from imperialist countries. Compared to this hypothetical situation of equal exchange, the gain of the imperialist countries from the actual unequal exchange amounts to $276 billion from low import prices and $36.4 billion from high export prices, totaling $312.4 billion for the year 1980. To provide perspective, the entire gross national product of the United States in 1980 was $573 billion. The amount of value transferred by way of unequal exchange in a single year was 3 times bigger than the amount of profits repatriated by multinationals from investments in the Third World over an 8-year period. The flow of value by unequal exchange has taken place decade after decade, steadily growing in size. The gain from unequal exchange in 2009 was calculated as $4,900 billion. Unequal exchange is the elementary transfer mechanism that enables the advanced countries to regularly give new impetus to that unevenness of development. The constant value transfer ensures enough purchasing power in the north for stable growth, while the drain of value makes stable national development in the south impossible. The Gernot-Köhler method. In the 1990s, the Canadian economist Gernot-Köhler developed an alternative method to estimate the size of unequal exchange. Instead of wage differentials, Köhler's model used the structure of the world currencies. He contended that the value of money is non-homogeneous throughout the world system and that the currencies of low-income countries tend to be undervalued. In international trade, the conversion of local currency into a trading currency, like the US dollar, is done according to the current exchange rate on the financial market. However, The consumption power of different currencies is not in line with these exchange rates. What one could buy in China for a certain amount of local currency does not correspond to the goods available in the US for the equivalent amount in dollars. In general, the currencies of countries outside the imperialist core are undervalued in terms of consumption power. We can express equality between the exchange value of a currency and its consumption power by the concept of purchasing power parity, or PPP. This is a conversion factor used for international comparisons of income levels. The difference between the purchasing power parity value of a currency and its exchange rate is what Curler calls the deviation factor of a country. The peripheral countries typically have permanently high deviation rates, indicating undervalued currencies. This form of unequal exchange can be expressed in a formula: T equals D1 divided by D2 multiplied by X, where T is the amount of value transferred, D1 is the deviation factor for the low-income country, D2 is the factor for the high-income country, and X is the volume of exports. The difference between purchasing power parity and nominal exchange rates is called the exchange rate deviation index. A rate above 1 indicates that the current exchange rate is undervalued. A country with an overvalued currency has favorable terms of trade and benefits from value inflows. With this method, Curler measured that the unequal exchange in 1980 was $300 billion, reaching $1,750 billion by 1995. This study measures only the trade of finished goods and does not include the growing trade in components within global production chains. A recent study following Curler's method found that value transfer reached a maximum of almost $3 trillion per year before the global financial crisis. The Andrea Ricci contribution. The Italian economist Andrea Ricci also followed this method, constructing an international theory of value based on Marx's writings. He explains the formation of national currencies and how the exchange rate between them is influenced by differences in productivity. This phenomenon, called the pen effect, is a long-term, systematic overvaluation of richer countries' currencies and an undervaluation of poorer ones compared with purchasing power parity. If the exchange rate on the financial market is different from the purchasing power parity rate, then the terms of trade are unequal. Value transfer by international trade for each country can be calculated using the formula T equals 1 minus the exchange rate deviation index multiplied by the exports in value added. Ricci's study measured a rise in value transfer from about $1.3 trillion in 1995 to $3.9 trillion in 2019. For the imperialist core, the value transfer increased from 5.4% of gross domestic product in 1995 to 7.8% in 2018. Emerging countries like China showed a rapid reduction in value outflows. By contrast, the poor periphery, including Africa, suffered a deterioration. While Ricci considers differences between official currency rates and purchasing power parity rates to be the basis for unequal exchange, I uphold that the basis is the national deviations in the price of labor from the global value of labor. The wage difference is the independent variable and the driver in the generation of unequal exchange. Jason Hickel and colleagues' contributions. In 2024, Jason Hickel and his colleagues published a groundbreaking empirical study of unequal exchange covering the years 1995 to 2021. They demonstrated that unequal exchange is driven by wage inequalities directly accounting for sectors, wages, and skill levels. The study showed that while global production is overwhelmingly performed in the global south, the yields are disproportionately captured in the global north. The south now contributes more high-skilled labor to the world economy than all combined labor of the global north. Despite contributing over 90% of the total labor that goes into global production, the global south receives only 21% of global income. The analysis confirms a substantial and persistent pattern of unequal exchange. In 2021, the global north imported 906 billion hours of embodied labor from the south, while exporting only 80 billion hours in return, a ratio of 11 to 1. This net appropriation occurs across all skill categories. In any given year, the north consumes roughly twice as much labor as it renders. Southern wages are 87 to 95% less than northern wages for equal work at the same skill level. This disparity is so extreme that high-skilled labor in the global south receives 68% less than low-skilled labor in the global north. For every hour of work, northern workers are able to consume 8 to 19 times more of the global product than southern workers. These wage gaps prevail across all sectors of the economy. Unequal exchange on the individual level. The prerequisites and mechanisms of unequal exchange can also be seen at the level of the individual wage laborer. There is a balance between the appropriation of value through the consumption of goods produced by low-wage labor and the exploitation of labor through the extraction of surplus value in the production process. A worker cannot benefit from capitalist exploitation unless their wages contain surplus value extorted from other workers. Due to the considerable difference in wages between North and South, it is possible for capital to employ labor in the North with a relatively high wage, while at the same time, this wage earner consumes more value than he or she creates. In concrete terms, the value of smartphones, tablets, clothing, and food produced in the global South and consumed by workers in the global North may be greater than the value extracted from northern wage earners in the production process. Already in 1857, Marx discussed the possibility of workers drawing advantages from the labor of other workers when the goods they produce are sold for less than their value. Whether a worker belongs to the labor aristocracy is a matter of calculation. I estimate that the transition point, the income threshold at which workers begin to consume more value than they produce, is as low as $4 per hour, which is around $650 per hour. A wage earner in the global North can therefore consume more value than they produce. Appropriation of value in the North through consumption is higher than the exploitation by capital through the surplus value extracted through the labor process. Peeling to the apple core, a specific example of this relation is the consumption of Apple products. In 2010, at a weighted average wage of 55 cents for migrant workers in Chinese factories, a worker would need to work 907 hours to purchase an iPad or 1,089 hours to afford an iPhone 4. At an average of $28, a US industrial worker needed only about 18 hours to afford the iPad or 21 hours for an iPhone, less than 2.5 workdays. The American enjoyed a consumer surplus of over 1,000 hours in comparison to the Chinese laborer. Even the most impoverished American worker, earning around $7 an hour, could purchase these items with less than 8% of the hours required of the Chinese migrant worker. The political economy of a t-shirt. Another example is the garment industry. H&M has all production outsourced to hundreds of suppliers. In 2016, monthly wages at factories in Bangladesh were approximately $87, which is enough to pay for only about half of basic necessities. The price formation of a t-shirt manufactured in Bangladesh and sold in Germany for €4.95 shows that the average labor cost to produce one shirt is roughly 10 to 15 cents. H&M's profit is 7 to 6 cents per shirt, which is 5 to 7 times what is paid to the workers in Bangladesh. The German state receives 79 cents in value-added tax, which is used to pay for welfare benefits. The sales tax alone is significantly higher than the wages the workers receive to produce the clothes. The value acquired by workers in the global North through the consumption of goods produced by low-wage workers has been growing throughout most of the 20th and 21st centuries. However, unequal exchange reached its peak around 2010 and is now declining for the first time in a century, partly due to rising wages in China and the erosion of the neoliberal world market. China, for instance, has significantly reduced its value outflow from around 19% between 1995 and 2007 to only 10% between 2007 and 2019. This individual-level perspective on unequal exchange, analyzing the balance between appropriation through consumption and exploitation through surplus value, also allows for differentiating between sectors of the working class within nations, such as the high-wage labor aristocracy and lower-waged immigrant labor in the global North. In conclusion, the value transfer by unequal exchange has a magnitude that helps explain the vast difference in living standards between workers in the global North and the global South. It is not merely a matter of the yearly flow of value, but the historical continuity of this flow over decades. This persistent transfer of value has bolstered consumption power in the North, balancing expanded production and fostering dynamic industrial development there, while effectively blocking development in the South. The political consequences of unequal exchange, the break in international solidarity. In the 1970s, literally hundreds of articles in academic journals and left-wing magazines discussed Immanuel's concept of unequal exchange. He became a well-known academic, together with people like Samir Amin, Andre Gunder Frank, and Immanuel Wallerstein. Unequal exchange is not an easy read, but it is rewarding in the same way as Capital. Besides his systematic rigor in argument, another appealing characteristic of Immanuel's writings is that he dares to break with established left-wing orthodoxies. Already in June 1970, Immanuel wrote in Monthly Review, "The most bitter fruits of my work on unequal exchange was the negative conclusion arrived at regarding the international solidarity of the working class. Loyalty to the nation transcends internal conflict of interest, on the one hand, while on the other, it grows stronger in the consequence of international antagonism. National integration has been made possible in the big industrial countries at the cost of international disintegration of the proletariat. As I said in my book, when the relative importance of the exploitation which the working class suffers through belonging to the proletariat continually decreases as compared with that which it benefits through belonging to a privileged nation, a moment comes when the aim of increasing the national income in absolute term takes precedence over that of improving each section's share relative to that of the others. This is what the workers of the advanced countries have well understood, becoming, over the last half-century, increasingly social democratized, either by supporting the social democratic parties already in being or by social democratizing the communist parties themselves. The main argument for the continuing international solidarity of the proletariat was the following. It may be that workers in the global north are less exploited than workers in the global south, but this is no reason why they should not act together to expropriate the exploiters and recover all the surplus value in global capitalism. This argument might be valid if all workers were donors of surplus value, but this is not the case. Today, the majority of workers in the center are no longer donors, but receivers of surplus value, which can only come from the labor of workers of other nations. The problem is that even if one were to expropriate all the capitalists of the world, the value produced would not be enough to ensure equalization from above, both in terms of income and in terms of material resources. Global ecology cannot sustain a world living the northern way. Andrea Ricci sums up Emmanuel's position. Wage growth in more developed countries acts as the ultimate cause of the continuing deterioration of the terms of trade for less developed countries, and consequently, central workers are the primary beneficiaries of the super-exploitation of the peripheral proletariat through the transfers of value deriving from unequal exchange. The latter point was by far the most provocative, and it triggered the start of a heated discussion among Marxist scholars and political activists of the North and South. Emmanuel did nothing to mitigate the political and practical implications of his thesis, but rather he stressed them in their whole scope. In fact, he argued that the increases in wages of central workers are paid for the most part by the surplus labor extracted to the peripheral workers, and to a lesser extent by the capitalists of the whole world by a reduction in the international general rate of profit. In this way, Emmanuel resumed and amplified the thesis of the labor aristocracy used by Lenin, who explained the opportunism of the British labor movement up to the First World War by the distribution of a small part of the imperialistic superprofits to a privileged upper stratum of the working class for influencing the mass of proletariat towards collaborative positions. Actually, Emmanuel went far beyond Lenin by asserting that the phenomenon of the labor aristocracy cannot be attributed uniquely to a case of false consciousness, induced by a corrupted fraction of the labor movement, but it is rooted in the material interests of the great majority of the working class of the central capitalist countries. According to Emmanuel, in capitalist developed countries, the sum of total wages is greater than the total value created by the entire workforce, so that the central workers are net beneficiaries of exploitation because they directly appropriate part of the surplus value extorted to peripheral workers. In other words, the central workers and capitalists of the whole world participate together to the exploitation of the peripheral workers, who then are the sole real producers of the worldwide surplus value. Emmanuel's political conclusion was that the international solidarity of the proletariat is a chimera, because the central workers are fully aware of their privileges as net receivers of surplus value, and for this reason, they give overall support to the imperialistic policy of the capitalist powers. Emmanuel made his position on the difference in class struggle in the center and periphery clear in a letter to Samia Amin. I agree with you that the bourgeoisie of the periphery is not exploited. How could it be? I believe that the antagonism between the proletariat and the national bourgeoisie in the countries of the periphery is as irreducible as a class antagonism can be. This is not the case in the countries of the center. There, in my opinion, there is a clear trend towards national integration. This does not mean that there are no more internal contradictions in the rich nations. There are some, and they can even sometimes take on extremely violent forms, but they are no longer irreducible. I call an irreducible antagonism when the share of some can only improve in strict proportion to the deterioration of the share of others. They are constantly transcended by the national pact. The term aristocratic nations is literary, I grant you. It is true that there is a world bourgeoisie and a world proletariat, but there is also a world labor aristocracy. I didn't create this appellation. It was created by Engels a century ago, theorized by Lenin and Bukharin over half a century ago. There is nothing in this theory that allows us to set quantitative limits to the workers' aristocracy. Its limits are historical and contingent. There is nothing to exclude the fact that in this or that country, at this or that time, it encompasses the majority or even the entire working class of the nation. The concept of the world proletariat will not be altered by this. And we do not have the right to accept Lenin and Bukharin's theory of the workers' aristocracy for the period when it was of interest only to the minority of the working classes of certain nations, and to reject it when it happens to be of interest to the majority of these classes in another period, and to disturb us terribly. While the economic theory of unequal exchange was discussed and to some extent accepted in academic circles, the political consequences were dismissed. The scandalous idea that the workers of the rich countries benefited from the transfer of surplus value from the workers of the poor countries made Emmanuel few political friends in the First World. However, some Marxist historians compared Emmanuel's work to the most important anti-colonial writings. Emmanuel's standpoint was either heavily criticized or the issues were treated as a taboo. It became difficult for Emmanuel to get published by traditional left-wing book publishers. Other unequal exchange theorists, such as Samir Amin and Immanuel Wallerstein, were more reticent on the issue of the break in the global solidarity of the working class. Amin, however, stated that in the centres, the popular classes benefited during the post-war period from an exceptional situation based on the historic compromise imposed on capital by the working classes. Recent studies underline that unequal exchange is ultimately driven by the corporations and investors that control supply chains, and the states that determine the rules of international trade and finance, not by workers or consumers. In the mid-70s, very few organizations in the global north supported Emmanuel's position on the split in the working class, except for my group, the Communist Working Circle, with its theory of the Scandinavian countries as parasite states. Another was the Liberation Support Movement. There were also some individuals, like Hodie Edwards from Boston. She became a communist in the 1930s and, disillusioned by the anti-communism and racism of the 50s in the US, moved to Ghana in 1961 to support the newly independent nation. After the 1966 coup against Nkrumah, she moved to London, where she published an important book on the Labour aristocracy as the mass base of social democracy. So when we read Emmanuel's articles and his book, it's not surprising that we were interested in getting in contact. In 1974, a member of our group visiting Paris went to Emmanuel's address to talk, but as Emmanuel was not home, he slipped some of our pamphlets into the mailbox. A week later, he got a letter from Emmanuel, regretting that he was not at home and expressing interest in exchanging materials. Emmanuel admired what he called our moral and intellectual courage and noted that there were few passages in our text that he would not sign. He was particularly impressed by our clarification that the Marxist notion of the labor aristocracy does not inevitably mean a minority. If Lenin generally wrote about it as a minority, it simply reflected the historical reality of his time. Emmanuel had introduced the notion of unequal exchange as early as 1962. In his work with Charles Bettelheim, they asked whether it was necessary to enlarge Lenin's notion of the labor aristocracy by saying that the working classes of today's advanced countries constitute the labor aristocracy of the earth. The international solidarity of the proletariat has always been cherished as an important strategic position for communists, and it is indeed important. However, it is problematic to not face reality when this solidarity does not exist. In spite of Marx's and Engels' persistent call for international solidarity in the Communist Manifesto, they did not shy away from criticizing workers when this solidarity was lacking, as in the case of workers' support for European colonialism. Lenin fought against the pro-colonial policy of the European Social Democrats in the Second International, and the Third International, established in 1919, tried to make the communist parties in Western Europe prioritize anti-imperialism, but this proved to be in vain. Emmanuel comments on this lack of anti-imperialism and international solidarity by the working class in the West. The hopes that revolutionary Marxism based upon this solidarity have been so cruelly disappointed in recent years that perhaps the time has come to emancipate ourselves from this taboo. Marxism did not completely overlook the possibility of the class struggle becoming weakened through a certain margin of reforms that the advanced capitalist countries were able to provide by dipping into the super profits of international exploitation. But it linked this phenomenon with the imperialist phase and restricted its bearing to the upper stratum of the proletariat, so that it appeared to be transitory in character. This was approximately Lenin's position. Bukharin could even say in 1928 that certain countries are aristocratic because they possess a labor aristocracy whose standard of living is higher than that of the average for the world proletariat. To have a standard of living higher than the world average today, it is not necessary to belong to a specialized labor aristocracy. It is enough to be the humblest street sweeper in a rich country. Bukharin once spoke of a relative and momentary solidarity of interest between capital and labor on the basis of an increase in wages made possible by colonial superprofits, even noting that European workers were the winners of this policy. When we read this, we ask whether this solidarity of interest, however temporary, has an objective basis or is merely the effect of a monstrous deception. Engels, as early as 1858, noted that the English proletariat was becoming more bourgeois, aiming for a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat as well as a bourgeoisie, which he called justifiable for a nation that exploits the whole world. In the orthodox line of Marxism, this objective basis was regarded as illusory. Revolutionary Marxism chose to consider it an opportunist deception based on increased employment and what Bukharin called the additional pennies received by European workers from colonial policy. Accordingly, revolutionary Marxism concentrated its fire upon the leaders of this deception in the vain hope of exposing them to their supporters. After repeated defeats and the experience of the first worker state, it was realized that little was to be expected for the defense of that state from the solidarity of working classes in capitalist countries. To explain a historical fact that has endured for nearly a century by the corruption of leaders and the deception of the masses is hardly in conformity with the method of historical materialism. The concept of false consciousness was introduced to explain why workers seem more interested in the benefits of citizenship than in international class solidarity. Propaganda has an effect, but it does not last for generations without a material basis. Working class support for the imperialist policy of their nation exists because they instinctively understand that they benefit as a class from the exploitation enabled by that policy. They are not innocent sheep. While the manufacture of consent plays a role, it should not obscure the material basis of that consent. Emmanuel continues, political parties are not churches possessing eternal truth. They are opportunists by nature, since their business is the conquest of the masses and the seizure of power. A party cannot ignore structural objective conditions persisting for several generations. When a deep-seated change has occurred in objective conditions, a class party eventually reaches a moment when it has either to transform itself or to disappear. Due to the time lag between base and superstructure, when objective antagonisms are intensified, the masses are more revolutionary than their parties, but when antagonisms soften, the parties remain for a long time more radical than the masses. This is what happened between the end of the 19th century and our time. It is not the conservatism of leaders that has held back the revolutionary elan of the masses. It is the slow but steady growth in awareness by the masses that they belong to, privileged exploiting nations that has obliged the leaders to revise their ideologies so as not to lose their clientele. Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, noted in 1973 that the only difference between the 19th century European working class and the global situation today is that the beneficiaries now are the national economies of rich nations, including their working classes. Disagreements about the division of the spoils now occur between workers and capitalists within those rich economies. The imperial mode of living. Instead of using terms like treason or corruption to explain the pro-imperialist attitude of workers and their leaders, researchers have introduced the concept of the imperial mode of living. This concept describes the deeply rooted patterns of production and consumption that presuppose disproportionate access to nature and labor power on a global scale. Developed capitalism requires an outside from which it obtains raw materials and to which it shifts social and ecological burdens. This imperialist world order is normalized in countless acts of production and consumption, making its violent character invisible to those who benefit from it. The imperial mode of living connects everyday life with international structures. Exploitation of nature and labor power is not just a structural feature of the relationship between North and South, it is inherently linked to and mediated by exploitative structures elsewhere. Humankind has become a driving geophysical force, but this impact is always mediated by relations of power, class, and race. People in the capitalist societies of the global north consume considerably more resources than those in the south. The imperial mode of living also incorporates a feminist perspective regarding unpaid care work and an anti-racist perspective regarding migrants. One reason for the spread of the patriarchal nuclear family model into the working class was colonial profits. The gender roles championed by the workers' movement in the late 19th century corresponded to the development of the labor aristocracy. Rising wages and the spread of the bourgeois family model led to a shift where women were often withdrawn from the industrial workforce. Without the exploitation of external colonies, the establishment of the internal colony, the nuclear family with a woman maintained by a male breadwinner would not have been possible. White men in Western Europe and North America ruled over their own colonies in the form of a nuclear family, a factor that helped ensure they became loyal citizens. The European workers' movement also showed a lack of sympathy for the struggles of indigenous and oppressed peoples. Racism and notions of European superiority emerged as a result of colonialism. When Frantz Fanon wrote that Europe is the creation of the Third World, he meant it literally. Material wealth flowed from the colonies to raise up Europe's tower of opulence. Colonial discourse defined European as civilized and others as barbaric, justifying brutality and plunder. This hierarchy of humankind created by colonialism lingers today in how immigration laws differentiate between non-Western immigrants and Western expats. Since the onset of colonialism, working and living conditions in the global south have been geared to the economic needs of the capitalist centers. Europe became the supposed center of modernity through a historical process of power that constituted certain forms of division and control of labor. Race became the fundamental criterion for distributing the world population into ranks and roles. The population in the global north is born and socialized into this imperial mode of living. Their actions and choices are made under conditions transmitted from the past. A person's place of birth seems more important than their class in terms of access to education, health, and welfare. This mode of living is normalized in daily acts and its consequences are kept at a distance. Imperialism is simply seen as how the world works. The infrastructures of everyday life in areas like food, transport, and energy rely on material flows from elsewhere. Workers in the global north depend on these systems. It is often not an individual choice to purchase cheap food or drive a car. Rather, people are forced into this mode of living because it is institutionalized in the systems that sustain them. The working class fought hard for these living standards, but they succeeded because the struggle took place in the context of global imperialist accumulation. The result was a state based on power sharing between capital and labor within the framework of the capitalist welfare state. To speak of bribes is an oversimplification, but as conditions improved, reformist sections of the labor movement were strengthened and revolutionary ones weakened. Emmanuel writes that while antagonisms continue within developed nations, a moment comes when the aim of increasing the national income in absolute terms prevails over improving the relative share of one part of the nation. From that point, national solidarity ceases to be challenged in principle. A united front of workers and capitalists in well-to-do countries, directed against poor nations, coexist with an internal struggle over sharing the loot. Trade union struggle in the richest countries often degenerates into corporatism. Workers in advanced countries now hold frontline positions in defending the national interest. For example, during the Vietnam War, appeals to national interest were often enough to stop strikes by American dockers. In former times, dockers went on strike precisely to prevent imperialist interventions. Now, they might strike to prevent trade with countries like Cuba. Even the civil rights struggle in the US was at times framed by the argument that black Americans could not fight for principles abroad that they were denied at home, implying that if those principles were granted, there would be no objection to the overseas adventures. While behavior should be criticized and changed, researchers argue that the core starting point for change is not just personal responsibility, but pointing out the social structures and patterns of inequality that reproduce the imperial mode of living. However, there is a clear relation between being and consciousness. The imperial mode of living creates an interest in the defense of imperial structures. The history of the imperial mode of living. The imperial mode of living emerged gradually. By the end of the 19th century, the northwestern European population had become mass consumers of goods imported from colonies, especially sugar, rice, tea, coffee, and tobacco. Cotton, the most important raw material of the Industrial Revolution, was imported from slave plantations. Even the poorest classes spent a significant portion of their income on colonial imports. People began having tea with sugar and bread with jam instead of the porridge that had been the staple food for centuries. The discussion of the relationship between imperialism and living conditions is not new. It was raised at the turn of the century by economists who explained why capital needs colonial markets and relies on the exploitation of foreign territories. Capitalism needs external areas both to exploit and to dump its ecological and social problems. These critics were the first to speak of the colonizing power as a parasite on the colony. They expected a future where a wealthy elite kept the masses content with high wages for service-oriented jobs, living on the manual toil of laborious inferiors abroad. This describes how the world economy looks during neoliberal globalization. Capitalists buy the docility of Western working classes by sharing the profits obtained from low-wage labor. China has become the productive industrial center of the world, while Western Europe and North America have turned into consumer and service societies. This parasitism involves a group of advanced nations whose upper classes draw vast tribute from Asia and Africa to support great masses of retainers no longer engaged in agriculture or manufacture. Lenin adopted these terms and extended the analysis, noting that the export of capital sets the seal of parasitism on the whole country that lives by exploiting the labor of several overseas countries. Out of enormous superprofits, it is possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. This stratum of workers turned bourgeois is the principal social prop of the bourgeoisie, acting as their real agents in the working class movement. Unless these economic roots are understood, no step can be taken toward the solution of practical problems of the communist movement. Lenin's theory highlights the power sharing between labor and capital in the management of the parasite state. The parasite state is still a capitalist state, but it is a special form characterized by parliamentary democracy and welfare for the majority. Its government represents the interests of global capitalism while easing the working class's misery in the north on the back of the global south. The imperial mode of living describes how economics works at the micro level, shaping identities. For example, the automobile industry and infrastructure fuse into imperial automobility. Advertisements connect driving with freedom and identity. The imperial mode of living promises individuality and material well-being while breaking with universal norms of equality. We choose products depending on the identity we want, internalizing the idea that free choice in consumption equals individual freedom. Neoliberalism runs through our veins, more than our chains to lose. As neoliberalism introduced more privatized patterns of consumption, finance capital penetrated everyday life. In the US and Western Europe, a large percentage of the population became homeowners. When ownership turns into financialization and speculation, it becomes an important source of income. Ordinary people could at times make more money on the real estate market than on the job, using the rise in equity for further consumption. Financial speculation made its way into daily life. Another link training the working class in the global north to global capitalism is the pension system. Today, occupational pensions are an essential part of labor agreements. These funds are invested as capital in shares and bonds to get the highest profit for the individual earner. The workforce has become structurally integrated into global financial circuits. American and European workers rely on securities markets for their pensions and healthcare. If the savings relation is in the direct control of private financial markets, workers acquire a rentier interest. In countries like Sweden and Denmark, more than 90% of wage earners have an occupational pension, and the assets of these funds are enormous compared to the national gross domestic product. Large parts of the working population in the global north live or will live as rentiers on their pension capital. This change in the political dimensions of class struggle strengthened reformism. For employers, accepting reforms was less risky than provoking revolution. On the national level, the working class struggles for its share of the social product, but internationally, they have turned into citizens identifying with the interest of their imperialist national state. Marx and Engels observed that every industrial centre in England possessed a working class divided into two hostile camps, English and Irish. The ordinary English worker hated the Irish worker as a competitor who lowered his standard of life, cherishing national and social prejudices against him. Representative of the Third World have not been deceived, arriving at realistic and disillusioned conclusions about the limited difference a revolutionary proletariat in the West made to their problems. Because an assessment of class interests is crucial for choosing partners in the struggle, we must face the fact that large sections of the population in the global north benefit from how global capitalism works. Lenin noted that as a result of extensive colonial policy, the European proletarian partly finds himself in a position where it is not his labor, but the labor of practically enslaved natives that maintains society. This provides the material basis for colonial chauvinism. Lenin did not see the certainty of victory in the workers of privileged nations themselves, but in the fact that those nations were in the minority. Revolution would take place without the opportunist nations. While that was written in 1969, the truth remains important today as the West experiences a deep crisis. Political competition between liberal and reactionary camps drags the Western working class into a vortex of contradictions. Globalization is being contested from the West itself because it fears losing hegemony. Neoliberal strategy used soft power to export the West as a space of freedom, while resorting to subversion or military aggression when met with resistance. The populist reactionary option appeals to the defense of white proletariat interests against the multinational proletariat, blaming immigrants or foreign goods for economic difficulties. There will come a day. The phenomena of the labor aristocracy, the parasite state, and the imperial mode of living are historical. Future changes in the balance between appropriation of value through consumption and exploitation by wage labor will have political consequences. Want and misery do not necessarily lead to revolution, but a revolutionary situation requires that the ruling class can no longer rule in the old way and the oppressed will no longer accept it. The bourgeoisification of the working class was a historical phenomenon which opens up the possibility of change. The working class in the global north occupies a dual position. They are objects of exploitation performing wage labor, but they are also able to acquire value through consumption of low-wage goods from the south. Whether they are exploited or exploiters depends on the balance between these two factors. Without this double perspective, the theory becomes static. If one denies the significance of the transfusion of value to the north, one falls into the fog of seeing every economic struggle as a revolutionary one. If one denies that workers in the north produce value at all, then one rejects their role in the struggle against capitalism. The rise of China has changed the game. The US can no longer dominate through technological superiority and is destroying the neoliberal world market it once created. Trade patterns are shifting, alternative financial institutions are developing, and the position of the dollar is challenged. These changes can shift the balance between appropriation and exploitation in the north. Whether the working class will then support imperialism to regain their position or join the global south is a question for the future. The hallmark of a Marxist is to have an analysis, strategy, and praxis in the vortex. Profit and crisis. Profit and crisis addresses the fundamental contradiction in the capitalist mode of production, the contradiction between production and consumption, which creates recurrent crises. To maximize profits, capital needs to expand production and provide the market with an ever-increasing quantity of goods. However, the consumption power of the market, created by this production, cannot absorb these goods. The result is recurring overproduction that produces a crisis of capital. As Marx wrote, Overproduction is specifically conditioned by the general law of the production of capital to produce to the limit set by the productive forces, exploiting the maximum amount of labor without consideration for the actual limits of the market or the needs backed by the ability to pay. The purchasing power of the market is limited by the exploitation necessary for capitalist accumulation. On the one hand, the capitalist needs to keep wages as low as possible to make the biggest profits. On the other hand, wages make up a significant part of the purchasing power required to realize a profit through sales. In other words, the capitalist form of accumulation tends to destroy its market. If capitalists increase wages, their profits decrease. If they decrease wages, their markets decrease. In both cases, capitalists become hesitant to invest, not because they cannot produce, but because they do not know if what they produce can be sold. Emmanuel explains that in all other systems, the remuneration of the direct producers constitutes an income and nothing else. In the system of wage labor, this remuneration, besides being an income for the wage earners, is a cost for the employers, who are also the only decision makers concerning the allocation of factors. To maximize profits, employers minimize costs, keeping wages at the lowest possible level. But profits are proportional to sales, and sales are proportional to social incomes. Since wages are a major social income, the efforts of entrepreneurs to maximize profits through wage reduction or stagnation lead to the minimization of both sales and profits. While means of production can also be sold profitably, they cannot serve as a substitute for sales of consumer goods. Rather, they are an increasing function of the latter. Marx emphasized this fundamental contradiction, noting that the ultimate reason for all real crises remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, as opposed to the drive of capitalist production to develop the productive forces, as though only the absolute consuming power of society constituted their limit. Emmanuel's method in Profit and Crisis is a critique of classic economists, specifically Jean-Baptiste Say, who argued that production creates its own market, keeping the system in a natural balance. However, historical experience indicates that capitalism does not have a problem producing commodities, it has a problem selling them. Even if capitalists could predict exactly what consumers want, the consumption power generated by production is not enough to buy all the products, realize profit, and continue accumulation. At first glance, Say's thesis seems logical. The share of the price spent on raw materials, machines, and auxiliary materials, along with wages paid and profits made by subcontractors, creates demand. The workers can buy their share, and the profit can buy the rest. This seems to guarantee a balance. However, Emmanuel insisted on a structural imbalance. The wage component turns into consumption power as soon as it is paid out. The problem lies with capitalist profit. Profits are not available until all commodities are sold, but all commodities are not sold because the profit is missing on the consumption side of the balance. Purchasing power is therefore always a step behind supply. This is confirmed by the fact that you can always get commodities for your money, but you cannot always get money for your commodities. Real existing capitalism is a combination of economic laws the system must adhere to, primarily generating profit, and the historical development making this possible. The development of unequal exchange was the historical solution to mediate the contradiction between capitalism's need to expand production and the ability of consumption power to absorb those commodities. This contradiction was allowed to exist without blocking the system through imperialism, the transfer of value to the center by unequal exchange. Specifically, the development of colonialism using super exploitation in the periphery generated the value transfer needed to raise the wage level in the center. This was necessary to provide sufficient consumption power to meet the growing level of production and realize profit through sales. Overproduction is always latent in capitalism and manifest under certain conditions. After 1870, the trade union struggle and the rise in salaries helped advance capitalism out of this dilemma to a certain extent. This historical development created dynamic economic development in the center and a permanent crisis in the periphery, where value transfer decreased consumption power and blocked capitalist development. The political economy of trade, balanced value transfer by unequal exchange, is not the only method to mobilize extra consumption power. Another method is to gain access to other countries' markets. With an export surplus, a country gets rid of surplus production in exchange for foreign currency, which can be turned into consumption power in the home market. This keeps the domestic employment rate high and adds to an affluent home market. This explains the obsession of economic experts and ministers with having a permanent export surplus, also known as a positive trade balance. The aspiration to have a positive trade balance reflects the contradiction in capitalism. Exporting means goods leave the country, while importing means receiving goods. To give more than you receive seems foreign to capitalism, but for a national economy it is different. If this drain of goods to foreign markets avoids an overproduction crisis and leads to increased production and employment, it is compensated by a higher rate of accumulation in the long run. On the global level, overall trade is always in balance. What gives one country a dynamic development generates a deficit and problems for others. The competition for a trade surplus is a zero-sum game. It does not solve the contradiction on the global level, it just moves it around geographically. The attempts by individual countries to improve competitiveness by holding back wages, cutting state budgets, and using tariffs diminish total world production and trade. One country's home market is another's export market. The US is currently disrupting the neoliberal world market, which served it well for half a century, through blockades, sanctions, and tariffs. By the end of the Second World War, the US was the dominant global industrial power. It preached free trade because it had a large surplus production and insufficient domestic demand. By imposing free enterprise, often forcibly, it opened new markets for its exports. Up until 1976, the US had a positive trade balance. Since then, the US trade balance has been negative without exception, running the largest account deficit in history. This has only been possible because the US can print dollars without backing in produced goods, as the dollar is the global reserve currency. Billions of dollars circle the world in trade transactions and never return to the US to claim goods. The pursuit of a permanent surplus in the trade balance is an expression of the national level imbalance between the size of production and the consumption power it generates. The drive to maximize profit leads capitalists to produce more effectively at a reduced cost, including reducing wages. However, those wages are needed for consumption to realize that profit, creating a weak point in the system. The limiting factor is the market, the ability to sell. The relationship between production and consumption is turned upside down. The size of production and types of goods are decided by market forces. Human needs are only valid if backed by purchasing power. Nothing is produced without an expectation of sale. Idle hands and underutilized resources may exist alongside urgent needs for food and shelter, yet those needs go unmet if not backed by cash. In capitalism, purchasing power is the condition of the scale and nature of production. Marx observed that as capitalistic production develops, it is forced to produce on a scale that depends on the constant expansion of the world market. A deficit in the trade balance, measured in world market prices, does not necessarily mean a negative balance in terms of consuming values, because it accelerates growth, employment, and consuming power in the center. This deficit in the price of goods is balanced by a drain of value in terms of labor time concealed in the price structure. Pushing the problem into the future. A third way to gain extra consumption power is to postpone the problem by creating debt. Public and private debt has grown consistently, amounting to $250 trillion in 2023, or 250% of global GDP. Private debt accounts for about 150 trillion, and public debt around 100 trillion. Cash flow is created by letting the printing press run and issuing government bonds. A government bond is a loan certificate that the government guarantees to repay with interest. These are investment opportunities for excess capital, as investors do not expect governments to go bankrupt. US government bonds are considered a safe haven, allowing the US to increase its government debt to over $33 trillion in 2023. Total US debt was over 700% of GDP in 2024 and around 40% of global debt. Debt levels are projected to increase even faster due to geopolitical tensions and massive spending on arms. Governments pump huge sums of paper money into circulation to keep the wheels turning. This money is based on loans or bonds without backing in production. These mountains of debt create bubbles of financial capital that risk bursting. Banknotes and bonds are essentially pieces of paper or numbers in accounts whose value relies on the trust that they can be turned into goods. The trust in US bonds and the dollar is linked to the status of the US economy and its political power, which was consolidated after the Second World War through the Bretton Woods Agreement and institutions like the IMF and World Bank. This status is now being challenged by the emerging multipolar world order. Threats of tariffs on countries that avoid using the dollar indicate the seriousness of this challenge. Changes in global trade patterns toward more South-South trade, the fragmentation of the former neoliberal market by tariffs and sanctions, the threat of bursting bubbles, and the declining role of the dollar all herald a major economic crisis in capitalism in the coming decades. Over and under development in capitalism. The center-periphery structure created by European colonialism released the forces of production, leading to the breakthrough of modernity in Western Europe. In a dialectical way, Marx affirmed the progressive features of capitalism, new technology, science, industrialization, and urbanization, while denouncing the exploitation, human alienation, and colonialism inherent in this process. Marx defended modernity because it prepared the way for socialism. In the mid-19th century, Marx and Engels believed capitalism would be a matter of decades rather than centuries. They saw globalization as the solution to the contradiction between expanding production and limited consumption power. Marx described the tendency toward globalization in the Communist Manifesto, noting how the need for expanding markets chases the bourgeoisie over the whole globe, compelling all nations to adopt the bourgeois mode of production and creating a world in its own image. Marx saw capitalism's development as a centrifugal process that would turn the rest of the world into a mirror image of England. Initially, this prediction seemed correct as English capital helped develop continental Europe and the United States. Marx believed a similar process awaited the colonies of Asia and Africa. He wrote that England had a double mission in India, one destructive, annihilating old Asiatic society, and the other regenerating, laying the material foundations of Western society. He expected the introduction of railways to become the forerunner of modern industry in India. Even in the early 20th century, Lenin still seemed to believe in this centrifugal power, noting that the export of capital accelerates the development of capitalism in the countries to which it is exported. According to the dominant Marxism of the time, the difference in development was merely a matter of a time lag. The deadlock was expected in the center, which needed the periphery as a market for capital and commodities. Rosa Luxemburg and others argued this would only postpone a crisis of overproduction. However, around the end of the 19th century, this classic scheme stopped reflecting reality. The centrifugal forces of diffusion gave way to centripetal forces that siphoned resources. Continental Europe, North America, and Oceania became mirrors of England, but countries like India saw their development blocked. What changed the centrifugal process into a polarizing one? The answer lies in understanding the mechanism by which resources are transferred from the periphery to the center. This transfer allows the center to exceed its consumption limits while blocking development in the periphery through low-wage superexploitation. We must distinguish between financial imperialism, involving investment and repatriation of profits, and trade imperialism, involving unequal exchange based on wage differences. Empirical studies in the late 1970s revealed that profits from investments in the Third World were not large enough to explain the difference in living standards. However, wage differences between the center and former colonies had expanded from 5-1 before the Second World War to 15-1 by the early 1970s. International trade, based on a division of labor exchanging raw materials for industrial goods, carried this value from the global south to the global north. Unequal exchange was estimated to exceed $300 billion yearly by the late 1970s. While capital investment generates production, the price structure based on wage differences, not just profit repatriation, is the primary vehicle of international value transfer. Polarized development. The origins of unequal exchange and polarized development between center and periphery are both rooted in the development of different wage levels. While Emmanuel described the rise of wages in the center through trade union struggle, Rue Mauro Marini in the Dialectics of Dependency described how Latin America's economic development was linked to Europe's requirements. This created a relationship of subordination, where the relations of production in subordinate nations were modified to ensure the reproduction of dependence, leading to the development of underdevelopment. The international division of labor created separate circles of capital accumulation in Latin America and Europe, linked together on a world scale. As an exporter of raw materials, Latin American capital circulation did not depend on domestic consumption power. The contradiction between expanded production and the need for consumption was solved by European and North American demand. In the imperialist core, workers as buyers are important for the market. But in the dependent export economy, worker consumption is irrelevant to the realization of the product. The system exploits the labor force to the maximum without worrying about creating conditions for its replacement, as long as new workers can be incorporated. Worker consumption is depressed to raise profits in export industries, while the consumption of luxury products by the elite is fulfilled by imports from the center. This separates individual consumption from unaccumulated surplus value, stratifying the internal market. In the imperialist core, industrial production focused on goods for popular consumption as wages increased. Capital moved toward increasing productivity through new technology, relative surplus value to produce more with less labor. In contrast, the periphery relied on absolute surplus value, such as longer and more intense labor. Capacity to compete rested on low wages. The value transfer from the periphery in the form of cheap food and raw materials allowed core workers to win higher wages, which in turn incentivized the core to raise productivity further. Development and underdevelopment became two sides of the same process. Contrary to Marx's early prediction, India never became a modernized mirror of England. Later in life, Marx acknowledged this polarization, describing how the English took vast sums from India annually without equivalent, amounting to a bleeding process that caused susceptibility to famine. Meanwhile, settler states like the US, Canada, and Australia became clones of England, developing their own peripheries to exploit. The exploitation and underdevelopment of Latin America, Asia, and Africa were required for the modernity of European and settler states. Over- and underdevelopment. The high wages in the center created a growing market that drove investment in production and technology. In the periphery, the small market and low price of labor made it more profitable to expand super exploitation rather than invest in technology. This polarized the world system through the 20th century. The center became overdeveloped precisely because the periphery was underdeveloped. Equalization at the highest level is materially and ecologically excluded without a qualitative change in consumption and lifestyle. This polarization remained through colonialism and neocolonialism. Advanced industrial production was initially not outsourced on a large scale due to transport costs and trade union strength in the north. However, this changed with neoliberalism. The need for profit led to the mass outsourcing of industrial production to the global south, made possible by new technologies like the internet, standardized containers, and just-in-time management. Emmanuel anticipated this, noting that multinational companies, MNCs, are independent of the domestic market in the country where they produce. Since the main problem of capitalism is selling rather than producing, MNCs could take advantage of low wages in the periphery and high wages in the center. This broke the vicious circle that had held up development in the Third World. While Emmanuel did not like MNCs, he shared Marx's dialectical approach. They developed the productive forces, preparing the way for socialism. China used transnational capital to develop its productive forces to the extent that it could break the polarizing dynamic of world capitalism. Appropriate or underdeveloped technology? Neoliberalism deregulated capital movement and trade, paving the way for a new international division of labor. Industrial production was outsourced from high-wage northern countries to low-wage southern countries from the 1980s onward. China became the world's largest producer of industrial commodities. In his 1982 book, Appropriate or Underdeveloped Technology, Emmanuel argued that MNC investments and technology transfer were better for accumulation than the underdeveloped technology available in third world countries. He argued that while capitalism is hell, underdeveloped capitalism is worse. By its nature, capitalism develops productive forces, creating a more favorable framework for social needs than past regimes. This provocative stand was in tune with the progressive role of capitalism mentioned in the Communist Manifesto. The encounter with neoliberalism varied. While it broke down the national project in the Soviet Union and led to debt crises in Africa and Latin America, the Communist Party of China kept its national project intact. China's rise as an economic power proved Emmanuel right. A poor country trying to develop socialism should not avoid interactions with advanced capitalism as their investment brings technology. However, the outcome depends on the state's ability to defend a national project for the benefit of its working classes. Ecology and unequal exchange. Above the economic and political structural crises is the deepening contradiction between the capitalist mode of production and planet Earth's ecosystem. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes argued that it was humankind's destiny to conquer, domesticate, and control nature to ensure its own survival. Capitalism is an extension of this logic. It positions humankind against nature, ensuring the former dominates and exploits the latter. 500 years of capitalism have put so much pressure on non-renewable resources and natural habitats that we are now facing the consequences in the form of climate change and pollution. Marx and Engels were well aware of this problem, with Engels later writing that we should not flatter ourselves over human victories over nature. For each victory, nature takes its revenge. He reminded us that we do not rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, but instead belong to nature with our flesh, blood, and brain. The exploitation of raw materials, depletion of soil, and burning of fossil fuels, all to satisfy capitalism's need for growing production, consumption, and accumulation, steadily sharpened this contradiction throughout the 20th century. In the 1950s, this entered a new phase where human activity began to have a decisive influence on the state and future of the Earth system. The rise of consumer societies in North America, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia after the Second World War resulted in a dramatic rise in the consumption of oil and raw materials, and in turn, carbon emissions. Historically, the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, and Australia have contributed a total of 61% of global carbon emissions. In contrast, China and India combined account for 13%, Russia for 7%, and the rest of the world for 15%, and the rest of the world for 15%. This global inequality becomes even more pronounced if we calculate emissions based on consumption rather than production. The logic of the capitalist mode of production makes it difficult to solve these problems through international negotiation. Instead, the discourse is moving from sustainability toward gaining resilience against nature's inevitable reaction. Emmanuel's contribution. Ecological sustainability was largely absent from theories of imperialism in the 1970s, but Auguste Emmanuel was aware of it. He noted that the periphery was not just underdeveloped, the center was overdeveloped. In 1975, he wrote that Americans consumed nearly 700 kilograms of steel per head per year. If the whole world consumed at that rate, all known reserves of iron ore would be exhausted in 40 years. Similar equalization of world consumption would exhaust copper in 8 years and tin in 6. The most total deadlock is oil. At the level of North American consumption, the world would need some 14 to 15 billion tons a year. Since known world resources were estimated at about 80 billion tons, this would be enough for only about 5.5 years. Even including yet to be discovered reserves or those exploited through new technology, the supply would only last around 11 to 22 years at the American rate. Ecological constraints. Exhaustion of resources is not the only factor preventing world equalization from above. Ecological limits constitute another barrier. Developed countries can currently dump waste into the sea or air only because they are the only ones doing it on such a scale. Similarly, their inhabitants can fry the world's skies only because the rest of the world lacks the means to do so. If the majority of the population adopted these patterns, the ecological balance of the world would be irrevocably disturbed. International solidarity. In these calculations, we are not dealing with abstract concepts like surplus value or financial categories like interest rates, but with the consumption of real substances. This implicates the vast mass of the population and wage earners. The rich countries can only consume the commodities that make up their material welfare because others consume very little or nothing at all. This reality destroys working class solidarity between rich and poor countries. Certain nations have fused into a sort of class nation, while others remain divided into classes. In the former, a true political struggle becomes increasingly difficult, giving way to strictly economic struggles over the distribution of the spoils. Consequently, the countries on the periphery become the only true revolutionary area. Their local conservative forces are allied with nations belonging to the same class as the global center. Any class contradictions remaining in developed countries become secondary to the main contradiction found in international economic relations. Ecological unequal exchange building. On Emmanuel's economic model, a school of theorists has related unequal exchange to ecological devastation. Instead of focusing solely on the trade of commodities, they look at global flows of materials and waste. Stephen Bunker, a pioneer in this field, argued that the unbalanced flows of energy and matter from extractive peripheries to the productive core provide a better measure of unequal exchange than labor or prices alone. He noted that the fundamental value in lumber, minerals, oil, and fish is predominantly in the good itself rather than the labor incorporated in it, while the difference in the usage of biomass is a material expression of the divide between rich and poor. It is ultimately wages that determine the mechanism. For some economists, ecological unequal exchange is a complement to economic exchange. It creates patterns of overconsumption in the north that have devastating ecological consequences elsewhere. Analysts measuring natural capital have calculated that residents of wealth-concentrated countries require 4 times as much land on average to sustain their lifestyles as residents of poorer countries. John Bellamy Foster and Brett Clark emphasized that transfers of economic value are accompanied by material ecological flows that transform relations between city and country and between the global metropolis and the periphery. Unequal exchange, backed by political and military power, allows the global north to import and consume natural capital far beyond its own borders, forcing poor countries to surrender their resources and pursue non-sustainable development. The ecological dimension differs from the economic one because environmental problems are global and do not respect national borders. Pollution and climate change affect everyone, though the burden of suffering is unevenly distributed. Overconsumption drives intense competition for natural resources, and the exponential growth characterizing capitalism resembles a cancer for which sustainability is impossible. Capital consistently seeks to externalize the costs of pollution, as paying for them with threatened profits and accumulation. The current geopolitical struggle has further diminished the possibility of solving climate problems through international cooperation. Appeals to capitalist-oriented governments are often in vain, as the ecological crisis cannot be solved within the capitalist mode of production. For half a century, international climate summits have reached non-binding agreements while emissions continue to rise and ecosystems unravel. We must develop a new mode of production within this century to avoid a major ecosystem collapse. China, with its transitional mode of production, has presented a vision of an ecological civilization. Because the state has the power to command the economy, China has become a global leader in renewable energy and electric transport. Over the past decade, Chinese strategy has driven down the costs of solar and wind power by 90%. Chinese manufacturers now dominate the solar panel industry, accounting for over 70% of global production. While Western discourse often labels this as authoritarian propaganda, the reality is that China's per capita carbon emissions are less than half those of the United States. Historically, the US and Europe are responsible for the vast majority of concentrated atmospheric CO2. John Bellamy Foster argues that China's efforts are revolutionary compared to other countries because the state retains the capability for economic planning and collective values. Radical transformations in reforestation, pollution reduction, and food self-sufficiency show that a transitional mode of production can be superior to capitalism in addressing ecological needs. As global crises worsen, this transitional model can move out of the shadow of capitalist dominance toward a system in balance with the global ecosystem. Resisting unequal exchange. The development of unequal exchange has not happened without resistance from exploited nations. Dadabhai Naoroji, the Indian independence activist, was convinced that the primary reason for poverty was the colonial drain of wealth. Historically, colonial plunder blocked the development of productive forces in the periphery, creating the economic and political crises that fueled revolutionary uprisings in Russia, Mexico, and China during the early 20th century. The superiority of British industrial production once built an empire on which the sun never set, but it was challenged by the late 19th century by Germany, France, and the United States. In 1929, the Great Depression revealed a crisis of overproduction in the United States, proving the fragility of capitalist equilibrium. Jawaharlal Nehru noted in 1934 that Marx's predictions about capitalism's inherent want of equilibrium and its recurring crises were being realized. The South African example. The struggle in South Africa provides a modern lesson in the challenges of resisting the imperialist order. The African National Congress led a decades-long struggle against the white settler regime, initially committed to socialist goals like the nationalization of mines, banks, and monopoly industries. However, by the time the apartheid regime was dismantled in the 1990s, the international situation had changed. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and neoliberal globalization was at its height. In 1992, during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Nelson Mandela shifted his position. Advised by Chinese and Vietnamese communist leaders who were themselves beginning to invite private investment, Mandela concluded that insisting on nationalization would freeze out necessary investment. While the ANC broke the formal laws of apartheid, they did not establish a transitional state capable of taming neoliberalism for the benefit of workers. Instead, they conformed to structural adjustment programs, leading to privatized utilities and widening income gaps between white and black South Africans. Today, despite a growing black middle class, the vast majority of land and companies remain in the hands of white South Africans, and unemployment among young black men remains near 50%. The emerging multipolar world system. Despite these setbacks, the Global South is currently on the offensive. The decolonization process of the mid-20th century and the later globalization of production have transformed the former periphery. While national liberation was originally easier to achieve than economic independence, the rise of South-South trade and alternative financial institutions is now challenging Western hegemony. South-South alliances like the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, known as ALBA, have pioneered cooperation based on solidarity rather than market competition. For instance, Venezuela has delivered oil to Cuba in exchange for medical services, showing that it is possible to partially delink from the capitalist world market. The most significant initiative today is BRICS Plus, which includes Brazil, China, India, Russia, South Africa, and several new members. While these countries vary politically, they share a common interest in challenging the US-dominated financial order. BRICS Plus now accounts for roughly 36% of global GDP based on purchasing power parity, surpassing the 29% share of the G7 countries. This shift represents a historic break in the century-long polarization of the world system. The principal contradiction. The central conflict of our era is the decline of US hegemony versus the rise of China and the emerging multipolar world system. As the United States realizes it can no longer dominate through purely economic means, it has pivoted toward geopolitical struggles involving sanctions, blockades, and military pressure. According to recent reports, the US has imposed sanctions on a third of all nations. This weaponization of the dollar and the global market is forcing many states to seek alternative structures. In the United States, both political factions agree that the rise of China must be stopped. However, they are dealing with an economy far more robust than the Soviet Union ever was. The pillars of US hegemony military force and the dollar as the world currency are increasingly unstable. BRICS Plus countries are actively pursuing de-dollarization, trading in their own currencies and diversifying their central bank reserves away from US Treasury bonds. The US proxy war with Russia in Ukraine has disciplined the European Union back into the NATO fold, but at a significant economic cost to European industry. While the EU and Japan remain aligned with the US, they face humiliation and economic disruption as the US pursues its own solo interests. The rise of China. China's rise is the defining feature of the current multipolarity. By keeping its state intact and managing its engagement with neoliberal globalization, China has developed its productive forces under the governance of the Communist Party. Rather than renewing dependency, this has enhanced socialism with Chinese characteristics. China is now the world's leading industrial power, producing 35% of global gross production compared to the United States' 12%. Critics who label China as just another imperialist power often lack empirical evidence. China's exploration of minerals in Africa is frequently cited, but studies show China remains more of an exploited than an exploiting country in the global value chain. Unlike the US, which maintains over 900 military bases abroad and has a long history of overseas intervention, China has not carried out such military actions. Its Belt and Road Initiative focuses on infrastructure and offers loans on better terms than the IMF, without demanding structural adjustments. Value transfer and global conflict. Theoretical debates about value transfer further clarify the conflict. While some suggest wealth is now draining from west to east, actual data tells a different story. In recent years, it took approximately 6.5 hours of Chinese labor to equal the value of 1 hour of US labor in bilateral trade. Over a 40-year average, this ratio was a staggering 121 hours of Chinese labor for every 1 hour of American work. Western hostility toward China intensified when Chinese wages began to rise, reducing its exposure to unequal exchange. In the 1990s, China had to export huge quantities of goods to get necessary imports. Today, its terms of trade have improved dramatically. Furthermore, China has broken the Western monopoly on high-end technologies like high-speed rail, renewable energy, and microchips. This threatens the imperial arrangement that keeps the Global South dependent on expensive Western technology. The resistance from the Global South countering unequal exchange offers the basis for a global coalition to create a new international order. In the 1970s, Samir Amin advised third world countries to delink from the imperialist system, not for isolation, but to subordinate international relations to the needs of the working class and peasants. This requires a double process: national class struggle and the establishment of global political conditions that restore national sovereignty. Putting an end to unequal exchange cannot be done in isolation by individual countries. The driving force must be states and movements working together. In the 1960s, there was hope that national liberation movements would cut off the value transfer pipelines, creating a revolutionary situation in the center. However, the power of the capitalist world market was too strong, and neoliberal globalization provided an escape route for capital. To reclaim their sovereignty, Global South nations must redirect their trade patterns from South-North to South-South, where wage differences are smaller. They must also develop their own productive forces to break dependency on Western technology. China has already demonstrated this by breaking through technological monopolies and significantly improving its terms of trade. Global South countries also need their own financial systems to bypass the IMF and World Bank. Developing alternative means of international payment, such as those being explored by BRICS+, reduces the power of the dollar and weakens the US's capacity to use financial sanctions. We are approaching a point where the capitalist mode of production is becoming a globally destructive force, while the transitional models developed in the Global South have proven more effective at generating development and handling crises. The transformation towards socialism on the national and global levels. The transformation towards socialism is a long global process, not a sudden, simultaneous event. While capitalism developed within feudalism on a small scale, socialism requires the framework of a national state to plan production and distribution and to defend the project against a capitalist-dominated world. Attempts to build socialism in one country have often been forced to prioritize national survival over world revolution. However, genuine socialism must eventually be global, as capitalism is a global system. Transitions are historically linked to the stages of capitalist development. The road to global socialism necessarily passes through national struggles, but these must be fought with an internationalist perspective. Past failures do not mean the mission is impossible. They are trials in a long historical process as the capitalist mode of production reaches its limits. The transitional state and the world revolution. The transitional state balances national development with global socialist goals. Globalization itself is not the problem. The issue is the capitalist form of globalization under US hegemony. The national framework is a historical constraint that must be managed, not ignored. Contemporary China, for instance, views itself in a primary phase of socialism that will take decades to complete. While some see China as purely capitalist, its system projects elements of market socialism, supported by modern planning, public land ownership, and a priority on labor remuneration and environmental protection. Rather than state capitalism, it can be viewed as an economy with capitalists, but which is not capitalists, where political control remains paramount. Transitional states must interact with global capitalism as part of the transition process, but advanced socialism depends on solving center-periphery inequality and the global ecological crisis. Historically, nationalism has caused friction within the socialist camp, as seen in the Sino-Soviet split. it is crucial that national and regional contradictions are analyzed within the context of the principal contradiction, the decline of US hegemony versus the rise of multipolarity. The transition away from capitalism does not mean retreating to isolated national frameworks. World unification has become a condition of human existence. Advanced socialism. To move towards advanced socialism, we must develop the universal and global dimensions of the mode of production. This means eliminating residual exploitative relations and patterns of consumption that conflict with the global ecosystem. It involves promoting common prosperity and reclaim the commons from privatization. Developed nations are overdeveloped in capitalist terms because their status depends on the exploitation of others. As Argyri Emanuel argued, the only way for the Third World is to set fire to the capitalist stage, as capitalism cannot be universalized without hitting the limits of the planet. Reducing global inequality is not a reform to be delayed for a future socialist era. It is a vital part of the transition that requires international redistribution, wage floors, and minimum resource prices. This necessitates a political struggle for economic sovereignty, similar in scope to the anti-colonial movements of the past. Crisis and revolution in the global north. As the capitalist system becomes dysfunctional and destructive, it inevitably faces deep political and economic crises. In the global north, the ruling classes can no longer rule in the old way, but a majority of the working class still seeks to defend their imperial mode of living. The instability of the world system, exacerbated by unpredictable leadership and geopolitical warfare, only deepens these crises. Anti-imperialism must be central to any struggle in the global north. The working class must be convinced that their long-term interests lie in ending global capitalism rather than defending a welfare state built on the exploitation of the global south. While the challenge of building this consciousness is immense, new currents of anti-imperialist solidarity, such as those seen in support for Palestinian liberation, are schooling a new generation in how the global system of power works. These movements are essential for paving the way toward a more equal and sustainable world order.